It began in villages that should have been quiet, where the only sounds in winter were wind moving through bare trees and boots crunching softly on frozen ground. Krinkelt and Rocherath sat side by side on the Elsenborn Plateau, modest farming communities surrounded by open fields and shallow forests, never meant to become the center of one of the most critical stands of the entire Ardennes campaign. Snow lay thick on rooftops and roads. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys. To anyone passing through before December of 1944, they would have seemed ordinary, almost forgettable. That ordinariness was exactly what made them dangerous. The Elsenborn Ridge rose gently behind the villages, barely noticeable to the eye, yet commanding everything around it. Whoever held that high ground could dominate the roads pushing west, control artillery fire across the plateau, and choke the movement of entire armored formations. In the opening hours of the German Ardennes offensive, Krinkelt and Rocherath became the door guarding that ridge, and behind that door stood exhausted American infantry who had no intention of stepping aside. When the attack came, it came with violence that shattered illusion. Artillery fire slammed into the villages, tearing apart stone walls and wooden roofs with equal cruelty. Snow erupted into the air in dense clouds, falling back down mixed with ash and splinters. The quiet plateau became a thunderous bowl of sound, every explosion echoing across frozen fields. German infantry surged forward through smoke and fog, followed closely by armor pushing hard toward the roads beyond. The goal was simple: break through fast, seize the ridge, keep moving west, but simplicity does not survive first contact. American units rushed into defensive positions that barely existed hours before. Foxholes were scraped out of frozen earth with hands already numb. Machine guns were dragged into place under fire. Anti-tank weapons were positioned in streets and behind stone walls that would soon collapse. Orders were shouted, lost, repeated, improvised. Confusion was everywhere, yet resistance formed anyway. The fighting inside Krinkelt and Rocherath became brutal and immediate. German tanks pushed into narrow streets, never meant for armored warfare. Their engines roared, echoing off buildings as shells slammed into houses that exploded outward in clouds of debris. Infantry followed close behind, moving through doorways and alleys, trading fire at distances measured in steps rather than yards. The villages burned, roofs collapsed, walls shattered, snow melted into slush stained dark by smoke and blood. The Americans did not hold because it was comfortable. They held because falling back too soon would open the ridge. Hour by hour, the pressure increased. German units attacked again and again, throwing men and machines forward with determination sharpened by urgency. This sector was critical. Delay meant failure. Every minute lost here echoed across the entire offensive. But delay is exactly what the defenders delivered. Even when positions were overrun, small groups regrouped and counterattacked. When ammunition ran low, weapons were scavenged from the fallen. When houses became death traps, defenders pulled back to the next wall, the next street, the next frozen patch of ground. Tanks were knocked out at close range. Infantry assaults stalled under concentrated fire. The villages absorbed the violence and refused to yield quickly. Behind the villages, the Elsenborn Ridge waited. As German forces pressed forward, American commanders made a hard decision. Krinkelt and Rocherath could not be held forever, but the ridge must be. The order came to withdraw under fire, pulling back through smoke and snow to stronger positions on the high ground. It was not a retreat born of panic, but of calculation, and it worked. When German units finally pushed through the shattered remains of the villages, they expected momentum. Instead, they found themselves facing prepared defenses on commanding terrain. Artillery fire poured down from the ridge. Anti-tank guns covered open approaches. Infantry dug in with determination, hardened by what they had just endured. The advance slowed, then stalled, then began to bleed itself dry. Krinkelt and Rocherath had done their job. The battle did not end quickly. Fighting raged for days in bitter cold. Snowstorms swept across the plateau, hiding movement and freezing the wounded where they fell. German armor attacked repeatedly, only to be stopped by terrain, fire, and exhaustion. The Elsenborn Ridge did not break, and because it did not break, the northern shoulder of the Ardennes offensive never collapsed. That mattered more than anyone realized at the time. While other sectors bent under pressure, the stand at Krinkelt and Rocherath anchored the line. It denied the Germans critical roads. It disrupted their timetable. It forced fuel-hungry armor to fight uphill, under fire, in conditions it could not sustain. The offensive lost momentum here, bleeding away hour by hour against a defense that refused to give ground where it counted most. The villages themselves were left in ruins, homes were destroyed, churches damaged, fields torn apart by tracks and craters. What had once been quiet farming communities became symbols of resistance written in stone and snow. The Battle of Krinkelt-Rocherath was not famous because it was dramatic. It was famous because it worked. It showed how disciplined withdrawal could be as powerful as stubborn defense, how terrain could defeat armor, how ordinary soldiers, holding in impossible conditions, could decide the fate of an entire offensive without ever knowing it. Tonight, we return to those frozen villages, to the streets where tanks burned, to the snow-covered fields crossed under fire, to the ridge that had to be held at all costs, to the moments when delay became victory. Before we continue deeper into this story, I want to ask you something quiet and personal. Where in the world are you listening from right now, and what hour has settled around you? Is it late and still, or does the night feel like it is still moving? If these long, immersive journeys into histories help you slow down, reflect, or feel quietly connected to something larger than the present moment, consider subscribing and let these stories stay with you when the world grows quiet. December 15th, 1944. Private First Class Robert MacDonald of Company K, 394th Infantry Regiment, sat in a stone Belgian farmhouse basement, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The radiator in the corner clanked and hissed, but produced almost no heat. Outside, frost covered everything. The cobblestone streets of Krinkelt, the pitched roofs of the farmhouses, the frozen mud of the fields beyond. MacDonald was writing a letter home to his mother in Pennsylvania, telling her about this quiet sector near the German border, how the officer said it was the safest place on the entire Western Front. He wrote that he might be home by spring, that the war seemed to be winding down. In less than 15 hours, the largest German artillery barrage since 1918 would shatter the dawn, and nothing would ever be quiet again. The twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath sat 3 miles from the Belgian-German border, separated by barely 200 yards of frozen farmland. To American eyes in December 1944, they looked like 1,000 other Belgian villages. Stone houses with steep roofs, narrow streets, a church with a modest steeple. The 99th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Checkerboard Division for its distinctive shoulder patch, had arrived here in November. They were absolutely green, having never fired a shot in combat. The Army had deliberately placed them in this sector because intelligence officers believed it was the quietest place in Europe, perfect for breaking in inexperienced troops. The division held a 20-mile front, 4 times wider than doctrine recommended for a single division. But V Corps headquarters assured them that the Germans opposite had no offensive capability, that this was a rest sector, that nothing ever happened here. The men of the 99th tried to make themselves comfortable in those final peaceful days. They took over Belgian homes, paying local families for the privilege of sleeping in their barns and basements. They played cards by candlelight and talked about Christmas, which was 9 days away. Some went to church services in the village chapels. Officers studied maps and planned patrol routes, routine activities to keep the men sharp. At night, they could see the Siegfried Line in the distance, the concrete dragon's teeth and pillboxes that marked the German border. Sometimes they saw lights moving over there, but intelligence said it was just routine activity. The B-99th had no reason to doubt this assessment. They were new to war, trusting, still believing that the people with more information knew what they were talking about. But across that border, German observers watched everything through binoculars. They counted American vehicles. They noted which buildings housed command posts. They mapped every machine gun position, every foxhole, every potential strong point. They watched the Americans with the cold patience of veteran hunters studying prey. The German observers were from the 6th S Panzer Army, and they were anything but incapable of offensive action. Behind them, hidden under camouflage nets and in the forests of the Eifel region, sat 200,000 men, 1,400 tanks and assault guns, and 1,600 artillery pieces. The greatest concentration of German military power since the invasion of France in 1940, waited in silence, watching the American college boys settle into their quiet sector. The geography that made Krinkelt-Rocherath seem unimportant to American commanders made it invaluable to German planners. The twin villages sat at the convergence of 5 roads, the only paved road network in the northern Ardennes, capable of supporting heavy armored vehicles. The Ardennes forest, thick with pine and cut by steep ravines, was terrible tank country. Most roads were nothing but dirt tracks that turned to impassable mud when it rained or snowed. But through Krinkelt-Rocherath ran what the Germans called Rollbahn D, a paved road that led west toward Ligneville, then on to the Meuse River crossings. For SS Colonel Joachim Piper's armored spearhead, tasked with driving to Antwerp and splitting the Allied armies in half, this road network was everything. Without it, his tanks would bog down in forest trails. With it, he could reach the Meuse in 3 days. The entire northern thrust of Hitler's desperate offensive depended on capturing these 2 unremarkable villages within 24 hours. On December 13th, officers from the 99th gathered in a stone farmhouse to review their positions. Lieutenant Colonel McClernand Butler of the 394th Regiment spread maps across a wooden table, pointing out patrol routes and fallback positions. The discussion was academic, theoretical. Butler had been a lawyer in civilian life, and he approached military planning with a lawyer's attention to detail. But he was planning for routine operations, not for an offensive that would throw 250,000 men at his positions. The intelligence summary on his desk estimated no offensive capability in the German units across the border. Butler had no reason to question it. None of them did. They were doing everything by the book, following proper procedures, trusting the system. The system was about to fail them catastrophically. The 99th Division had been activated in November 1942 at Camp Van Dorn, Mississippi. Most of all, its soldiers were draftees, many of them college students whose educations had been interrupted by the war. They trained for 2 years in the United States before shipping overseas in October 1944. They landed in England, crossed to France, and moved up to Belgium, where they took over the quiet sector from veteran units rotating out for rest. In their entire existence as a combat division, they had not fired a shot in anger. The veterans they replaced offered advice, showed them the positions, told them not to worry. This sector was dead quiet. The Germans here were old men and boys, units burned out from fighting on the Eastern Front, no threat at all. The 99th believed every word. Why wouldn't they? The veterans had survived D-Day, the hedgerows of Normandy, the bitter fighting across France. If they said this sector was quiet, it must be true. But there were signs, if anyone had been looking for them. German artillery fire, which had been sporadic, ceased almost entirely in the first 2 weeks of December. Radio intercepts picked up unusual activity, units moving at night, coded messages increasing in frequency and urgency. A German woman who had worked as a maid in Luxembourg came across the lines on December 14th with a warning. German troops were massing, something big was coming. She was interrogated and dismissed as unreliable. Patrolling American soldiers reported hearing tank engines in the distance, but when they reported it, officers told them they were hearing their own tanks or imagining things. The intelligence system was not looking for signs of an offensive, so it did not see them. Everyone knew the Germans were beaten, on the verge of collapse. Everyone knew Hitler was finished. The war would be over by Christmas, or maybe February. The possibility that Germany could launch a major offensive was simply not considered credible. On the evening of December 15th, the temperature dropped to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Soldiers huddled around inadequate fires and failing radiators. In Krinkelt, Private MacDonald finished his letter home and sealed the envelope. In another basement, men from Company A of the 394th played poker for cigarettes. A squad from the 393rd Regiment was on patrol in the forest, moving quietly through the snow-covered trees, seeing nothing unusual. At the regimental command post, Colonel Butler reviewed the next day's plans. The division was supposed to attack toward the Roer River dams, a limited offensive to support operations farther south. Everything was organized, supplies were ready, the men were as prepared as green troops could be. At exactly 5:29 in the morning, all of those plans would become instantly irrelevant. Across the border in Germany, German artillery crews made final preparations in the darkness. They had spent days moving their guns into position, careful to make no noise that might alert American observers. Ammunition had been stockpiled in massive dumps, shells stacked in pyramids covered with camouflage netting. Each gun crew knew exactly what time to fire, exactly how many shells to send, exactly where to aim. At forward infantry positions, men from the 277th Volksgrenadier Division waited in the cold, checking their weapons one last time. Behind them, the tanks of the 12th SS Panzer Division idled in forest clearings, engines warm and ready. Everything was prepared. Everything was in position. And in Krinkelt-Rocherath, American soldiers slept or played cards or wrote letters, having no idea that the largest German offensive in 4 years was aimed directly at their quiet sector. In 14 hours, Private MacDonald's letter would still be in his pocket, undelivered, as he fought for his life in the ruins of the village he thought was safe. November 3, 1944. Adolf Hitler stood before a map table in his headquarters, the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, and unveiled a plan so audacious that his generals thought he had finally lost his mind. The operation was codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, a deliberate misnomer designed to make it sound defensive. But there was nothing defensive about it. Hitler planned to throw 3 armies, 200,000 men, and 1,400 tanks through the Ardennes forest, cross the Meuse River, capture Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in half. His generals, hardened veterans who had conquered Poland and France, sat in stunned silence. Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, called it a plan from cloud cuckoo land. General Hasso von Manteuffel, who would command the 5th Panzer Army, thought it was impossible. But Hitler was beyond accepting objections. Germany was dying, squeezed between Allied armies advancing from the west and Soviet forces grinding forward in the east. This offensive was not about military logic. It was a gambler's last desperate throw of the dice. The strategic situation facing Germany in November 1944 was catastrophic. In the east, Soviet armies stood on the borders of East Prussia. In the west, American and British forces had liberated France and reached Germany's western border. German cities were burning under Allied bombing raids that came day and night without pause. The Wehrmacht had lost over 1 million men since D-Day alone. Oil supplies were nearly exhausted. Steel production was collapsing. Any rational assessment of Germany's position concluded that the war was lost. But Hitler did not deal in rational assessments. He believed that the Allied coalition was unnatural, that Americans and British hated the Soviets, that one decisive blow could shatter their alliance. If Germany could seize Antwerp, the Allies' most important supply port, the British and Americans would have to negotiate. At least, this was what Hitler told himself and his generals. Whether he actually believed it or simply refused to accept defeat, no one could say. But he had the power to order the offensive, and so he did. Hitler chose the Ardennes for his attack because it was where the Allied line was weakest. The Americans had deliberately thinned out this sector, considering it unsuitable for tank warfare because of the forests and ravines. Most American divisions here were either green units getting their first taste of combat, or veteran divisions pulled out of the line to rest and refit. Hitler remembered that the Ardennes had worked in 1940, when German panzers had burst through this same region and reached the English Channel in 10 days. He believed it would work again. His generals were less optimistic. The situation in 1944 was completely different from 1940. In 1940, the French had been unprepared and demoralized. In 1944, the Americans were alert and confident. In 1940, the Germans had air superiority. In 1944, Allied aircraft owned the skies. But Hitler dismissed all objections. The attack would proceed. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper received his orders on November 25th. At 39 years old, Peiper was a veteran of the Eastern Front, where he had commanded armored units in some of the most savage fighting of the war. He was known for his aggression, his tactical skill, and his absolute ruthlessness. His battle group, Kampfgruppe Peiper, would be the spearhead of the entire offensive. His force consisted of 4,800 men, 600 vehicles, and 100 tanks, including 42 brand-new Panther tanks and 30 massive King Tiger tanks, the most powerful tanks in the world. His route had been carefully planned. He would break through the American front at Losheim Gap, drive through Losheimer Graben, pass through Krinkelt-Rocherath, continue west through Ligneuville, cross the Meuse River at Huy, and reach Antwerp in 4 days. On paper, it was brilliant. In reality, it depended on everything going perfectly. The timeline was everything. Peiper's orders specified that he must reach the Meuse River by December 20th. That gave him 4 days from the start of the offensive on December 16th. 4 days to drive 90 miles through enemy territory, in winter, with limited fuel supplies. The Germans had calculated that they had enough fuel for the first phase of the offensive, but after that, they would need to capture American fuel dumps to continue. This was not a plan. It was a hope dressed up as strategy. Piper understood the stakes. He briefed his officers on December 14th, spreading maps across tables in a German schoolhouse. He traced the route with his finger, explaining exactly what was required. Speed was essential. They could not get bogged down in fighting. They had to bypass resistance, push forward, and keep moving. Any delay could be fatal. His officers nodded, understanding. They were veterans. They knew what needed to be done, but privately, some of them wondered if it was possible. The assault plan for the northern sector hinged on the twin villages of Krinkelt-Rocherath. German intelligence had identified the 99th Division as absolutely green troops who would likely collapse under the initial artillery barrage. The 277th Volksgrenadier Division, 12,000 infantry, would attack at dawn, smash through the American lines, and clear the way for Piper's armor. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitler Jugend, would support the breakthrough and exploit success. Once the villages were captured, Piper would roar through on the paved roads and disappear to the west before American reinforcements could react. The Germans estimated they would control Krinkelt-Rocherath by noon on December 16th. This estimate was based on their assessment of the 99th Division's inexperience and their belief that American soldiers, comfortable and well-fed, lacked the will to fight a desperate defensive battle. It was a fundamental miscalculation that would cost Germany any chance of success. By early December, the German buildup was nearly complete. 1,600 artillery pieces were in position, hidden in the forests along the border. Supply dumps held millions of shells, thousands of tons of fuel, and mountains of ammunition. 300,000 men were ready to attack. The 6th SS Panzer Army in the north, the 5th Panzer Army in the center, and the 7th Army in the south. They had been assembled in absolute secrecy, moving only at night, maintaining radio silence, camouflaging everything. German deception efforts convinced Allied intelligence that the buildup was defensive, that the Germans were preparing to resist the inevitable Allied drive into Germany. The Americans and British bought it completely. Their intelligence summaries in early December described German forces as depleted, incapable of major operations, focused entirely on defense. It was one of the most successful deceptions of the entire war. Piper spent the final days before the offensive inspecting his units. He was meticulous, checking vehicles, testing weapons, reviewing routes with his commanders. His men were among the best Germany had left: veteran tankers, experienced infantry, soldiers who had survived years of combat. But they were also exhausted, fighting a war they knew was lost, motivated more by discipline and fear of what would happen to Germany if they failed than by any belief in victory. Piper drove them hard, accepting no excuses, tolerating no weakness. He told them they were making history, that this offensive would change the course of the war, that the Führer was counting on them. Some believed him. Others simply followed orders. All of them prepared to attack, checking equipment one last time, writing letters home that many would never send, waiting for dawn on December 16th. On December 15th, Hitler issued a final order of the day to the troops in the West. "Soldiers of the Western Front," it read, "your great hour has arrived. Large attacking armies have started against the Anglo-Americans. I do not have to tell you anything more than that. You feel it yourselves. We gamble everything. You carry with you the holy obligation to give everything to achieve things beyond human possibilities for our fatherland and our Führer." The message was distributed to every unit, read aloud to assembled soldiers. Some men cheered, others stood silent, understanding that "we gamble everything" meant exactly that. This was Germany's last card. If the offensive failed, there would be no recovery, no second chance. The end would come quickly. But if it succeeded, if they could reach Antwerp, if they could split the Allied armies, perhaps Germany could negotiate, perhaps the war could end on terms that spared the fatherland from total destruction. It was a desperate hope, but for men facing certain defeat, even desperate hopes had power. At exactly 5:30 on the morning of December 16th, 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The barrage fell across a 90-mile front, but the heaviest concentration landed on the positions held by the 99th Infantry Division around Krinkelt-Rocherath. In 90 minutes, the Germans fired 1.9 million shells. It was a volcanic eruption of steel and fire, designed to obliterate the American front line and shatter the will of inexperienced soldiers. Piper listened to the barrage from his command vehicle, checking his watch, counting the minutes until the infantry would advance and clear the way for his tanks. Everything was going according to plan. The Americans were being hammered. Soon the breakthrough would come. His tanks would push through, gain the roads, and the race to the Meuse would begin. He had 4 days to reach the river, 4 days to change the war, 4 days to save Germany. The offensive had begun, and for the first few hours, it seemed like Hitler's gamble might actually work. December 16th, 1944, 5:30 in the morning. Private First Class Robert MacDonald woke to a sound he had never heard before, a rolling thunder that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The stone farmhouse basement where he had been sleeping shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. The candles on the table guttered and went out. For a moment, nobody moved, frozen in confusion, brains struggling to process what was happening. Then the next salvo landed, closer this time, and the building lurched like a ship in a storm. Men scrambled for their weapons in the darkness, shouting questions that nobody could answer. The door burst open and Sergeant Hawkins appeared, his face gray with fear. "Get out! Get to your positions! We're under attack!" Outside, the world had turned into hell. The German artillery barrage was unlike anything American soldiers had experienced. Shells of every caliber rained down. 105mm howitzers, 150mm guns, massive 170mm pieces that could hurl a 100-pound shell 10 miles. High explosive rounds demolished buildings and blew craters in the frozen earth. Airburst shells exploded above ground, sending shrapnel scything through anything in the open. The Americans called the German Nebelwerfer rocket launchers screaming memes because of the distinctive shriek they made in flight, a sound that froze men's blood even before the explosions hit. 6 rockets would launch in rapid succession, filling the air with that terrible scream, then detonate almost simultaneously in a pattern designed to shred infantry caught in the open. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical destruction. Communication broke down within minutes. Telephone lines, strung on poles or laid on the ground, were cut by shell fragments. Radio antennas were blown down. Company commanders found themselves isolated, unable to reach battalion headquarters, unable to coordinate with neighboring units. At the command post of the 394th Regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Butler tried to make sense of the chaos. Reports came in from every direction, all of them bad. Company K was under heavy fire. Company L had taken casualties. Company I's command post had taken a direct hit. The forest positions were being hammered. German infantry had been spotted. Or maybe it was just shadows in the smoke. Nobody knew anything for certain. The entire regimental front was dissolving into isolated pockets of men fighting blind, cut off from higher command, making decisions on their own. Private MacDonald made it to his foxhole just as a shell landed 15 yards away. The blast wave knocked him flat and filled his mouth with dirt. His ears rang so loud he couldn't hear anything else. He pulled himself into the foxhole, found it already occupied by 2 other men from his squad, all of them pressed together in a space meant for one. They didn't speak, couldn't speak over the noise. They just crouched there while the world exploded around them. A tree burst apart, the trunk split by a direct hit, massive splinters flying like spears. Another shell hit the farmhouse MacDonald had just left, and the entire front wall collapsed. Through the smoke and snow, he caught glimpses of other American soldiers running between positions, trying to reach their assigned spots, some of them making it, some of them cut down by shrapnel. The barrage went on and on, 90 minutes of continuous bombardment, longer than anything anyone had experienced before. Then, at 7 o'clock, the barrage shifted. Instead of hitting the front lines, German guns began hammering rear areas, supply dumps, road junctions, command posts. The reason became clear almost immediately. Through the smoke and snow, gray figures appeared. Hundreds of them, thousands of them, German infantry advancing in waves. The 277th Volksgrenadier Division had received its orders: break through the American line, clear the way for the panzers, capture Krinkelt-Rocherath by noon. These were not the depleted, demoralized units American intelligence had described. They were veteran soldiers, many of them recalled from hospitals and leave to fill out the division, all of them understanding that this attack was Germany's last chance. They came forward in disciplined lines, covering each other, using the terrain, professionals executing a well-rehearsed plan. The Americans who survived the barrage found themselves facing an impossible situation. They were outnumbered, cut off from support, with their command structure shattered and their positions compromised. Green troops, men who had never been in combat before, were expected to hold against veteran German infantry supported by the heaviest artillery barrage of the war. Everything in their training said to hold the line, to maintain positions, to wait for orders. But there were no orders. The radios were dead. The telephone lines were cut. Each squad, each platoon, each company was on its own, making decisions without knowing what was happening 50 yards away. Some positions held, some fell back. Some were simply overwhelmed and disappeared. There was no coordinated defense because there could be no coordination. It was chaos. But something unexpected happened. The green troops of the 99th Division did not collapse. They did not panic. They did not run. In hundreds of individual firefights across the snow-covered forests and fields, American soldiers made stands. A machine gun team would set up in a foxhole and pour fire into advancing Germans until they ran out of ammunition, then fall back to another position and do it again. A rifle squad would hold a tree line until they were nearly surrounded, then fight their way out and establish a new position. Company commanders who couldn't reach battalion headquarters made their own decisions, organizing local counterattacks, coordinating with neighboring units by runner, improvising defenses. The Germans expected the Americans to break. Instead, they found themselves in a grinding, savage fight that chewed up time and men with every yard of advance. At the aid stations, medics worked in impossible conditions. Wounded men were being carried in faster than they could be treated. Supplies that were supposed to last a week were gone in hours. Buildings designated as aid stations were hit by artillery, forcing evacuation to new locations. Medics worked by candlelight, by flashlight, by whatever illumination they could find, performing field surgery that would have been considered impossible in peacetime. Men with wounds that should have killed them were stabilized and saved. Men with relatively minor wounds died because there were too many casualties and not enough medics. The medical personnel, many of them conscientious objectors who carried no weapons, moved through the battlefield under fire, dragging wounded soldiers to safety, earning the profound respect of the combat troops who saw their courage. By noon on December 16th, the German timetable was already slipping. The 277th Volksgrenadier Division had advanced, but not as far as planned. Krinkelt-Rocherath remained in American hands. Piper's armor was still waiting behind the infantry, unable to move forward because the roads were not clear. German commanders urged their troops forward, demanding faster advance, threatening consequences for failure. The infantry tried, launching attack after attack, but the Americans kept fighting. Small groups of soldiers, isolated and outnumbered, held positions that should have fallen in minutes and made the Germans pay for every yard. By afternoon, German casualties were mounting, not the negligible losses expected from smashing green troops, but serious numbers that started to degrade unit effectiveness. As darkness fell on December 16th, both sides took stock. The Germans had achieved a breakthrough. American positions were penetrated, the front line was broken, chaos reigned. But they had not achieved the clean breakthrough they needed. The road network through Krinkelt-Rocherath was not in German hands. Piper's timetable was already shot. He was supposed to be miles beyond the twin villages by now, racing west, but instead he was still stuck in traffic jams behind the stalled infantry, and something else was happening, something that would change everything. The 2nd Infantry Division, a veteran unit that had landed at Omaha Beach on D-Day, was moving east toward the fighting. The college boys of the 99th had survived the first day. Now the veterans were coming to join them, and together they would make the Germans pay a price beyond anything Hitler's planners had imagined. The volcanic dawn had failed to destroy the American defenders. Instead, it had forged them into something harder than anyone expected. December 16th, 1944, 10 o'clock in the morning. The convoy of the 2nd Infantry Division moved east on the icy roads toward Belgium. A long column of trucks and jeeps stretching back for miles. Staff Sergeant William Peterson sat in the back of a deuce and a half, surrounded by men from his rifle company, all of them veterans of Normandy. They had been through the hell of Omaha Beach, survived the hedgerow fighting in France, taken casualties in the bitter battles across Europe. Now they were heading toward what their officers said was a German breakthrough, though details were scarce. The men in the truck were making jokes, calling the 99th Division the college boys, saying they were going to rescue kids who probably ran at the first shot. Peterson, who had landed on Omaha Beach in the first wave, allowed himself a slight smile. Let them joke. Soon enough, they would see what was really happening up there. The sound of artillery grew louder with every mile. The 2nd Infantry Division was not supposed to be in a defensive battle. Their orders, issued days earlier, had been to attack toward the Roa River dams, an offensive operation designed to support the larger Allied push into Germany. They had been preparing for that attack, stockpiling ammunition, briefing officers, readying equipment. Then, at dawn on December 16th, everything changed. Reports came in of a massive German attack in the Ardennes. The offensive toward the Roer was cancelled. New orders arrived. Move immediately to the Krinkelt-Rocherath area and assist the 99th Division in containing the German breakthrough. It was a complete reversal, from offense to defense, with no time to adjust. The division packed up and moved out within hours, a testament to their training and experience, but nobody had any real information about what they were driving into. The first elements of the 2nd Division reached the twin villages early in the afternoon of December 16th. What they found shocked them. Krinkelt and Rocherath were under artillery fire, buildings burning, wounded being evacuated, and soldiers from the 99th fighting from whatever cover they could find. But these soldiers were not panicking. They were not running. They were fighting back with a determination that surprised the veterans of the 2nd Division. Staff Sergeant Peterson's company dismounted from their trucks and moved into position in Rocherath. A lieutenant from the 99th, his face blackened by smoke and his uniform torn, gave them a quick briefing on German positions. He spoke calmly, professionally, pointing out where the enemy was likely to attack next. Peterson exchanged glances with his men. These college boys had figured out how to fight. The joking stopped. Coordinating 2 divisions in the middle of a battle is a nightmare. The 2nd and 99th Divisions had different radio frequencies, different reporting procedures, different command structures. Officers from both divisions met in cellars and basements, trying to work out who was responsible for which sector, who would hold which position, how they would communicate. Maps were spread on tables, covered with marks showing friendly and enemy positions, though much of the information was hours old and already obsolete. Arguments broke out over tactics, over who should attack and who should defend, over whether to try to counterattack or simply hold. Time was slipping away while they argued, and outside, German forces were massing for another assault. Finally, senior officers made the decision. Both divisions would defend together, intermingling units, sharing the line, holding at all costs. The intermingling of units created chaos, but also unexpected strengths. A company from the 2nd Division would take position next to a company from the 99th. The veterans would share their knowledge, where to position machine guns for best effect, how to spot German infiltration tactics, how to conserve ammunition. The men from the 99th would share what they had learned in the past 12 hours, which buildings offered the best protection, where German artillery observers were likely to be, how the enemy was approaching. It was education under fire, a crash course in combat that compressed weeks of normal learning into hours. The veterans of the 2nd Division began to realize that inexperience was not the same as incompetence. The soldiers of the 99th had learned fast, adapted quickly, and were holding their ground against veteran German troops. Respect began to replace condescension. By evening on December 16th, the combined American force had established something resembling a coherent defense. The twin villages were turned into strong points, with interlocking fields of fire, communication lines re-established using runners when radios failed, and reserves positioned to counterattack any breakthrough. Tank destroyers from the 2nd Division moved into position, their crews scouting firing positions that would let them engage German armor while minimizing their exposure. Infantry platoons were assigned specific buildings to defend, with orders to hold until ordered to withdraw. Artillery forward observers established themselves in church towers and upper floor windows, ready to call fire down on attacking Germans. It was not perfect. Nothing about this situation was perfect, but it was functional. The Americans were no longer reacting blindly. They had a plan. The real test came on December 17th. German forces, frustrated by their inability to break through on the first day, committed fresh units and attacked with renewed intensity. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitler Jugend, one of the most experienced and fanatical units in the German military, joined the assault. These were not ordinary soldiers, but veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived years of brutal combat, led by officers who understood combined arms warfare. They brought tanks, self-propelled guns, and veteran infantry. The attack began at dawn with another artillery barrage, then German armor rolled forward through the snow. This was the moment that would determine everything. Could the combined American force hold against the SS, or would the defense collapse? Staff Sergeant Peterson watched from a second-story window in Rocherath as the first German tank appeared at the end of the street. It was a Panzer IV, its long 75mm gun traversing, looking for targets. Behind it came infantry, moving in short rushes, using the tank for cover. Peterson had seen this before in France. German combined arms tactics, armor and infantry working together, each protecting the other. He shouted orders to his squad, telling them to hold fire until the infantry was closer, to let the tank destroyer team deal with the armor. Next to him, a private from the 99th Division held his rifle with white knuckles, breathing hard. Peterson put a hand on the kid's shoulder. "Wait for my order," he said quietly. "Wait until they're in the kill zone. Then we make them pay." The kid nodded, steadying himself. Outside, the tank crept closer. The German tank stopped in the middle of the intersection, its turret rotating. The tank destroyer team, positioned in a barn 50 yards away, had a perfect shot at its flank. The M10 Wolverine's 3-inch gun fired once, the report deafening even inside the stone buildings. The German tank jerked, smoke pouring from its engine deck. The crew bailed out, running for cover, and American riflemen cut them down in the street. German infantry, seeing their armor support destroyed, tried to advance anyway. Peterson gave the order to fire. 20 rifles opened up simultaneously, joined by a machine gun positioned in an adjacent building. The Germans went down, some killed instantly, others wounded and crawling for cover. More Germans appeared, trying to flank the position, but they ran into soldiers from the 99th holding the building next door. The street turned into a killing ground. The combined American defense was working. By the end of December 17th, the German advance had been stopped cold in Krinkelt-Rocherath. German commanders were stunned. They had committed elite SS troops supported by armor, and they had been repulsed by what they thought were green American soldiers. They did not yet understand that those green soldiers were now fighting alongside veterans, that the defense was no longer a panicked scramble, but an organized resistance. The twin villages had become a fortress, not through deliberate fortification, but through the desperate innovation of men fighting for their lives. Buildings became bunkers. Streets became fire lanes. Every stone wall and basement cellar became part of an integrated defense. The Germans would attack again on December 18th, and again on December 19th, but they would never break through. The 2nd Division and 99th Division, veterans and rookies fighting together, had created something neither could have achieved alone. They had become a single force, forged in combat, tested beyond anything they had imagined. The regulars had arrived, and together with the college boys, they were holding the line. December 17th, 1944, 10:30 in the morning. The Panther tank rounded the corner onto Krinkelt's main street, its massive form filling the narrow space between buildings. The commander stood in the open turret, scanning for targets, confident in his vehicle's thick frontal armor. 40 yards away, hidden in the ground floor window of a stone farmhouse, Private James Cooper of the 99th Division aimed his bazooka at the tank's side. His hands shook. He had never fired a bazooka at all, real tank before. In training, they had practiced on hulks and targets. This was different. This was a 60-ton monster that could kill him with a single shell. His assistant loader whispered, "Ready," and Cooper pulled the trigger. The rocket motor ignited with a whoosh of flame and smoke. The shaped charge warhead hit the Panther just behind the turret ring. The explosion was enormous, and the tank lurched to a stop, smoke pouring from the engine compartment. The German crew tried to bail out, but American riflemen were already firing. The close-quarters battle for the twin villages had truly begun. Village fighting is among the most brutal forms of combat. The advantages of armor mean little when tanks cannot maneuver. The advantages of numbers mean little when only a few men can fit in a narrow street. Everything happens at point-blank range, 10 yards or 20, often less. Soldiers fire at enemies they can hear breathing in the next room. Grenades are thrown through windows. Buildings collapse on top of fighting men. There is no front line, no rear area. Every direction is potentially hostile. Soldiers from the 2nd and 99th Divisions discovered this reality on December 17th as German forces pushed into the twin villages. The fighting became a confused melee of small unit actions, each squad or platoon fighting its own isolated battle, often unaware of what was happening one street away. The Germans had trained for this. The veterans of the 12th SS Panzer Division had fought in cities on the Eastern Front, where they learned that urban combat rewarded aggression and ruthlessness. They moved in small teams, infantry and engineers working together, using demolitions to blast through walls rather than exposing themselves in doorways. They knew to always look up, because enemies in upper stories had the advantage. They knew to throw grenades before entering rooms, to spray automatic fire through walls, to assume every building was occupied until proven otherwise. But the Americans learned fast. Green soldiers who had never thought about urban tactics were inventing them in real time, discovering that the same building techniques that kept Belgian winter out also stopped rifle bullets, that stone walls could be loopholed for firing positions, that furniture and rubble could be stacked to create improvised bunkers. The church in Rocherath became a focal point of the fighting. Its stone tower offered observation over the entire village, and both sides understood its value. American forward observers had established themselves there on December 16th, using the height to call artillery fire on German positions. On December 17th, German troops assaulted the church repeatedly, trying to drive the Americans out. The fighting surged back and forth through the building. Germans would clear the ground floor, only to be driven out by Americans counterattacking from the tower. Americans would hold the nave, then be forced to withdraw when Germans brought up a self-propelled gun and blasted holes in the walls. At one point, German and American soldiers were fighting on different floors of the same building, neither able to dislodge the other, separated by wooden floorboards and locked doors. The church changed hands 3 times in one day. Tank warfare in the villages bore no resemblance to the sweeping armored battles of the open plains. German tanks that could dominate open terrain found themselves trapped in narrow streets where they could barely turn. Stone buildings limited their fields of fire. Rubble blocked their movement. American bazooka teams and tank destroyers could hit them from the flanks at ranges so close that even the thinner side armor could be penetrated. The Germans lost tank after tank to these close-range ambushes. A Panzer IV would advance down a street, and suddenly a bazooka round would hit it from a basement window 20 yards away. Or a tank destroyer would fire from an alley, the shot striking before the German crew even knew they were under attack. By the end of December 17th, the streets of both villages were littered with destroyed vehicles, German and American, their hulks providing cover for infantry fighting around them. The aid stations were overwhelmed. In basements and barns, medics worked by candlelight, treating wounds that ranged from minor shrapnel cuts to catastrophic injuries. The most common wounds were from shell fragments, jagged pieces of steel that tore through flesh and shattered bone. Then came bullet wounds, burns from fires and explosions, and crushing injuries from building collapses. Medical supplies, stockpiled for weeks of normal operations, were exhausted in days. Morphine ran out, plasma ran out, bandages were improvised from torn clothing. Surgery was performed with whatever instruments were available, often just a knife and forceps, sterilized by boiling when there was time, used dirty when there was not. Men died from wounds that would have been survivable with proper facilities and supplies. Others survived wounds that should have killed them, saved by the skill and determination of medics who refused to give up. Something remarkable happened in those aid stations. German and American wounded lay side by side, treated by the same medics, suffering together. At first, there was hostility. American soldiers did not want to be in the same room as Germans who had been trying to kill them. German soldiers, indoctrinated by Nazi propaganda, expected to be executed or tortured, but pain and shared suffering broke down those barriers. A German soldier with a shattered leg and an American with a chest wound found themselves holding hands as they waited for treatment. 2 men in agony who no longer cared about politics or nations. Medics treated whoever needed help most urgently, regardless of uniform. An American medic would stabilize a German soldier's bleeding, then move to an American with a head wound, then back to a German with burns. The aid stations became small islands of humanity in the middle of mechanized slaughter. By evening on December 17th, ammunition was becoming a critical concern. Soldiers who had started the battle with a full load, 80 rounds for an M1 Garand rifle were down to their last magazines. Machine gunners had fired thousands of rounds and were running low. Mortar crews were rationing shells. Artillery forward observers were calling for fire sparingly, knowing the guns were depleting their ammunition stockpiles. Officers ordered their men to make every shot count, to fire only at identified targets, to conserve ammunition for the major attacks they knew were coming. Some squads took ammunition from dead Germans, trying to make captured Mauser rifles and machine guns work, though differences in ammunition types made this difficult. The logistical system was struggling to push supplies forward through roads clogged with refugees, wrecked vehicles, and German artillery fire. The Germans were suffering their own supply problems. Their ammunition stocks were finite, expended at rates higher than planned because the Americans were resisting harder than expected. Fuel was critical. Every tank burned gasoline with every movement, every repositioning. The Germans had calculated fuel supplies based on reaching certain objectives by certain times, and those calculations were now worthless. They were behind schedule, still fighting for villages they should have captured on day one, burning fuel while making no progress. The longer the battle for Krinkelt-Rocherath lasted, the less fuel remained for the drive to the Meuse. German commanders urged their troops forward, demanding breakthrough, threatening consequences for failure. But the soldiers at the sharp end knew the truth. They were fighting veteran American troops now, not just green kids. The easy breakthrough was not coming. As night fell on December 17th, both villages were in ruins. Buildings had collapsed from artillery fire and tank guns. Streets were cratered by shells. Fires burned unchecked, their light casting orange glows against the smoke and snow. Bodies lay where they had fallen, American and German, some in the streets, others in buildings or vehicles. The temperature was dropping again, well below freezing, and wounded men who could not reach aid stations were dying of exposure. The living huddled in cellars and basements, exhausted, hungry, many of them wounded but still fighting because there was no choice. And outside, in the forests and fields around the villages, more German troops were massing for the attacks that would come with dawn. December 18th would be even worse. The collision of armies in those narrow streets was grinding up men and machines with industrial efficiency, and neither side could afford to quit. Too much depended on who controlled these two small Belgian villages that nobody outside the military had ever heard of. December 17th, 1944, 11 o'clock in the morning. 8 miles south of Krinkelt-Rocherath, at the village of Lanzerath, SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper stood beside his command vehicle and listened to reports that made his blood boil. His Kampfgruppe, the spearhead of Germany's last great offensive, sat motionless in a massive traffic jam. Behind him stretched miles of vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, trucks, self-propelled guns, all stopped, all burning precious fuel while going nowhere. The roads that should have been clear were clogged with stalled infantry units. The twin villages of Krinkelt-Rocherath, which should have fallen on December 16th, remained in American hands. His carefully planned route, the paved road that would carry him to the Meuse River, was blocked. Peiper's face was white with rage. He had been given 4 days to reach the Meuse. He had already lost 36 hours, and he had not even begun his real advance. The original plan had been brilliant in its simplicity. The 277th Volksgrenadier Division would smash through the American front at dawn, clearing the way through Krinkelt-Rocherath within hours. Peiper's armor would then roar through on Rolbahn D, the paved road network that led west to Ligneuville, Stavelot, and eventually the Meuse River crossings. Speed was essential. The plan allowed no time for fighting, only rapid movement, bypassing resistance, pushing forward, maintaining momentum. But the infantry had failed to break through. The Americans, supposedly green and inexperienced, had fought back with unexpected ferocity. Now Peiper's tanks sat idle, while the infantry was still grinding away at those damned villages. Every hour of delay meant more Allied reinforcements arriving, more time for the Americans to establish defenses, more fuel burned for no gain. Peiper made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He could not wait for the infantry to clear Krinkelt-Rocherath. He would take an alternate route, smaller roads through Lanzerath and Buchholz Station, bypassing the stalled northern approach entirely. His staff officers warned him that these roads were not suitable for heavy armor, that they would have to move in single file, that any breakdown would block the entire column. Peiper did not care. Sitting still meant failure. He ordered the Kampfgruppe to move south to find another way west. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon on December 17th, his column began moving again, leaving behind the direct route they had planned to use. The detour would add hours to his schedule, burn fuel he could not spare, and force him onto roads that led through villages where American resistance might be waiting. But it was movement, and movement was life. The alternate route took Piper through Hansfeld, a small Belgian town that his intelligence said was lightly defended. At dawn on December 17th, his lead tanks rolled into Hansfeld and found American rear echelon troops completely unprepared for an armored assault. Piper's men killed or captured hundreds of Americans, seized valuable fuel supplies, and pushed through the town in less than 2 hours. It was the kind of rapid advance Piper had expected to make all along, and it fed his rage at the delays caused by the stalled offensive at Krinkelt-Rocherath. If the infantry had done their job, his entire Kampfgruppe would be this far west already, not just achieving it after desperate improvisation. He pushed his column harder, demanding maximum speed, accepting no excuses for delays. But the detour was costing him in ways beyond time. The roads were narrow, forcing his tanks to move in single file. When a vehicle broke down, the entire column had to stop while it was pushed aside or repaired. Fuel consumption was higher than planned, because the routes were longer and the terrain more difficult. And worst of all, the noise of his column's movement was alerting American forces all along the route. The element of surprise, the key to the entire operation, was evaporating with every hour. American commanders were realizing that a major German armored force was moving west, and they were starting to react, throwing up roadblocks, mining roads, preparing ambushes. Piper was still advancing, but the easy breakthrough was over. From here on, every mile would be contested. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, on December 17th, near the Belgian village of Bulge, Piper's frustration manifested in horror. His lead elements encountered an American convoy and quickly overwhelmed it. Over 100 American prisoners were taken, men from an artillery observation battalion who had been driving toward the front. The Germans herded the prisoners into a field behind the road. Then, on orders that remain disputed to this day, German soldiers opened fire with machine guns. 84 Americans were murdered in what would become known as the Malmedy massacre, though it actually occurred near Baunez. Piper later claimed he gave no such order, that his men acted independently, but he was the commander, and the responsibility was his. The massacre would become one of the most infamous war crimes of the Western Front, and Piper would eventually be imprisoned for it. The massacre had immediate tactical consequences beyond the moral catastrophe. Word spread through American units with terrifying speed. German SS troops were executing prisoners. Surrender was death. American soldiers who might have surrendered when surrounded chose to fight to the end instead. Soldiers who might have treated German prisoners decently became harder, more vengeful. The massacre stiffened American resistance across the entire front, turning a military operation into a fight for survival. Piper had wanted to demoralize the Americans, to speed his advance by making them afraid. Instead, he had guaranteed that every American position would fight to the death, slowing him even further. By December 18th, Piper had advanced farther west than any other German unit, reaching the village of Stoumont, only miles from the Meuse River. It looked like success, but it was an illusion. Behind him, his supply lines were cut by American counterattacks. Ahead of him, American forces were massing to block his advance. His fuel supplies were nearly exhausted, his ammunition running low. And back at Krinkelt-Rocherath, the fighting continued, tying down German forces that should have been exploiting Piper's breakthrough. He was the tip of a spear that had penetrated deep but had no shaft to support it. Radio reports from 6th SS Panzer Army headquarters crackled with demands for progress, questions about when he would reach the Meuse, orders to push forward. Piper looked at his fuel gauges and knew the truth. He had gone as far as he could go. The battle at Krinkelt-Rocherath had broken the timetable that the entire northern offensive depended on. While Piper struggled forward on inadequate roads, the 12th SS Panzer Division was still hammering away at the twin villages, making no progress, losing tanks and men. The delay cascaded through the operation. Units that should have been advancing were stuck in traffic. Fuel that should have been available for the spearhead was being burned by vehicles sitting idle. Artillery support that should have been moving forward to support Piper was still firing on American positions at the twin villages. The entire northern thrust of the Ardennes offensive which was supposed to carry to Antwerp and split the Allied armies, was grinding to a halt because two small Belgian villages refused to fall. On December 19th, surrounded by American forces and out of fuel, Piper received orders to break out and return to German lines. It was an admission of failure. The deepest penetration of the offensive had to retreat. Piper abandoned his vehicles, destroyed his tanks so they would not be captured, and led his men on foot back through American lines. Many did not make it. The Kampfgruppe that was supposed to reach the Meuse in 4 days, that was supposed to change the war, that was supposed to save Germany, limped back having achieved nothing. And all of it traced back to those first 36 hours, those critical hours when Krinkelt-Rocherath was supposed to fall and did not, when inexperienced American soldiers held their ground and forced the Germans to detour, to delay, to bleed momentum. Piper's fury was justified. The infantry had failed him. But his rage missed the larger truth. The Americans had not failed. They had fought with a determination that wrecked every German calculation, and in doing so, they had doomed the offensive before Piper ever left the start line. December 17, 1944, early morning. Captain John McKinley of the 2nd Division's Combat Engineers stood in the center of Rocherath with a surveyor's eye, looking at the village not as a collection of homes, but as a weapons system waiting to be assembled. Belgian stone construction was solid, walls 18 to 24 inches thick, built to withstand centuries of winter weather. Those walls would stop rifle bullets and shell fragments. The narrow streets created natural choke points. The stone cellars offered protection from artillery. This was not a fortress by design, but it could become one through improvisation. McKinley pulled out a notebook and began sketching positions, calculating fields of fire, planning how to transform a peaceful village into an integrated killing zone. He had 6 hours before the next major German attack. It would have to be enough. The transformation began with the roads. American engineers, working with infantry from both divisions, began laying hasty minefields on every approach to the villages. These were not the carefully surveyed and marked minefields of deliberate defensive operations. These were desperate improvisations, using mines stripped from German defensive positions, captured during earlier fighting, now repurposed to slow German armor. The engineers buried the mines in the frozen ground, marked their locations on hand-drawn maps, and hoped they remembered where everything was when American vehicles needed to use the same roads. Some mines were simply placed on the surface, in shell craters or behind debris, relying on snow to conceal them. It was dangerous work done under intermittent artillery fire, but it multiplied the defensive power of the position enormously. Tank destroyers moved into carefully selected firing positions. The M10 Wolverine was not a tank. It had open-topped armor and was vulnerable to artillery, but its 3-inch gun could penetrate German armor at medium ranges, and its mobility let it relocate after firing, avoiding counter-battery fire. The tank destroyer crews, veterans who understood both the capabilities and limitations of their vehicles, positioned themselves behind stone walls and in defilade positions where only their guns were exposed. They created interlocking fields of fire, so that any German tank entering the villages would be in the kill zone of at least 2 destroyers. If one destroyer was knocked out, others could still cover its sector. It was textbook tactics executed under battlefield conditions. Infantry began modifying the buildings themselves. Soldiers punched loopholes through stone walls, creating firing positions that let them shoot without exposing themselves in windows or doors. They knocked holes through interior walls between buildings, creating covered passageways that let them move from house to house without going into the streets. Furniture was stacked to create improvised bunkers inside buildings. Church pews were dragged out and positioned across streets to create obstacles. Anything that could stop or slow a tank, wrecked vehicles, farm equipment, piles of rubble, was dragged into intersections. The villages were being turned into mazes where every turn was covered by fire, where every street was a potential kill zone. Communication was critical. Field telephone wire was strung through basement windows, connecting command posts to forward positions. Runners were designated to carry messages when phones failed. Artillery forward observers established themselves in the church tower in Rocherath and the tallest buildings in Krinkelt, with wire communications to the American artillery batteries positioned miles to the rear. These observers would become the most valuable men in the defense, calling artillery fire to within 100 yards of American positions, sometimes closer. The ability to bring down massed artillery fire on German attacks was the Americans' greatest advantage, but it required observers who could see the targets and communicate quickly. The improvised wire network made it possible. The innovation was not limited to engineering. Soldiers were inventing tactics in real time, learning from each engagement, sharing knowledge across units. A sergeant from the 99th discovered that German tanks were reluctant to advance past burning vehicles, fearing ambush. His squad began deliberately setting fires in the streets to channel German armor into predetermined kill zones. A lieutenant from the 2nd Division realized that German infantry always checked buildings from bottom to top, so he positioned his men on the 2nd floor with grenades, waiting until German soldiers entered below before attacking. A machine gun team found that firing from basement windows gave them excellent cover while making it almost impossible for Germans to spot the muzzle flash. These lessons spread through word of mouth, from squad to squad, building a collective knowledge of urban warfare. Medical evacuation routes were planned with the same attention to detail. Certain streets were designated as evacuation routes, kept clear of obstacles so that wounded could be carried to aid stations. The aid stations themselves were positioned in the most substantial buildings, usually with stone cellars that offered protection from artillery. Medical personnel marked these buildings with red crosses, though this offered limited protection. German artillery was falling everywhere, and the fog of war meant that marked buildings were hit as often as unmarked ones. Still, the organization meant that wounded soldiers knew where to go or where they would be taken, reducing the chaos of casualty collection under fire. Ammunition distribution became a science. Officers realized early that resupply during an attack was nearly impossible, so they pre-positioned ammunition caches throughout the defensive area. A squad defending a building would have ammunition stored in the basement, on each floor, and in a nearby building, ensuring that they could keep fighting even if cut off. Machine gun crews received extra barrels so they could sustain fire without overheating their weapons. Rifle companies received extra grenades, understanding that close-quarters fighting meant grenades were as important as bullets. The logistical preparation was unglamorous but vital. By late afternoon on December 17th, the architectural transformation was complete. Krinkelt and Rocherath no longer looked like peaceful Belgian villages. They looked like fortresses, every building a bunker, every street a fire lane, every intersection a kill zone. When German tanks attacked that evening, they found themselves in a maze where every turn brought new threats, where American guns seemed to fire from every direction, where the buildings themselves were weapons. The Germans had superior armor, superior numbers, and veteran troops. But the Americans had turned the terrain itself into an ally, multiplying their defensive power through desperate innovation. It was not sophisticated military engineering. It was improvised, crude, assembled under fire by men who had learned their trade in the last 48 hours. But it worked. The architecture of desperation became the architecture of survival, and the Germans would pay in blood for every yard they tried to advance. December 17th, 1944, 8 o'clock in the evening. The temperature in Rocherath had dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Private James Cooper huddled in the basement of a stone farmhouse with 11 other soldiers, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Outside, the sound of artillery was constant, a rolling thunder that never stopped. German flares arced into the sky, turning night into flickering orange day, shadows dancing as the flares drifted down on parachutes. In that horrible illumination, Cooper could see German infantry massing at the edge of the village, hundreds of men preparing for another assault. He checked his rifle for the 10th time. 2 magazines left, 16 rounds. An order had come down from the company commander. 1 shot, 1 kill. No suppressive fire. Ammunition was too low for anything but aimed shots. Cooper tried to steady his breathing, tried to stop his hands from shaking. He had been in combat for 36 hours. It felt like 36 years. The German assault began at 8:30. Infantry advanced in waves, moving from cover to cover, professionals executing well-rehearsed tactics. Behind them came tanks, Panthers, and Panzer IVs, their engines roaring in the cold air. The Americans held their fire, following orders, waiting until the Germans entered the kill zone. At 100 yards, an officer shouted, "Fire!" and the night exploded. Machine guns opened up from basement windows and upper floors. Rifles cracked from loopholes in stone walls. A bazooka team fired at a Panther tank, the rocket striking its track and immobilizing it. American artillery, called in by forward observers, began falling on the German assembly areas, shells bursting among the massed infantry. Germans kept coming, stepping over their dead, firing as they advanced. A German machine gun team set up in a ruined building and began pouring fire into American positions. Cooper saw tracers flying past the window above him, bright streaks in the darkness. By 10 o'clock, ammunition status was critical across the entire defensive perimeter. Companies that had started the battle with full loads were down to their last bandoliers. Machine gunners were firing in short, controlled bursts, trying to make each belt last. Mortar crews had stopped firing entirely, their ammunition exhausted. Officers were making impossible calculations, deciding which positions would receive the remaining ammunition and which would have to make do with what they had. Some squads were down to 3 or 4 rounds per rifleman. The order went out: fix bayonets. If ammunition ran out completely, if the Germans got into the positions, it would come to hand fighting. Soldiers who had never used a bayonet except in training fixed them to their rifles now, and tried not to think about what it would mean if they had to use them. The fighting reached a bizarre intimacy around midnight. In some places, German and American soldiers were separated by a single stone wall, close enough to hear each other breathing, close enough to shout insults and threats. In one building in Krinkelt, Americans held the first floor, while Germans occupied the second, neither able to dislodge the other. They could hear each other moving around, hear conversations in English and German, hear wounded men crying for medics in both languages. Grenades were thrown back and forth through holes in the floor. At one point, an American soldier and a German soldier met on the staircase, both coming around a corner at the same moment. They stared at each other for a frozen instant, both too shocked to react, then simultaneously dove back the way they had come without firing a shot. The wounded were everywhere. Aid stations were overwhelmed, with casualties coming in faster than medics could process them. Men with sucking chest wounds lay on the floor waiting for treatment. Men with shattered limbs tried not to scream, as medics worked without morphine, which had run out hours ago. The smell in the aid stations was indescribable: blood, excrement, gangrene, and the sickly sweet smell of burning flesh from cauterization. Medics worked by candlelight, their hands covered in blood, performing surgery that would have been malpractice in peacetime, but was life-saving in these conditions. A doctor from the 2nd Division's medical company amputated a soldier's crushed leg using a hacksaw and a knife, working without anesthetic, while other soldiers held the screaming man down. The soldier survived. At 2 o'clock in the morning, something unexpected happened. A German medic carrying a Red Cross flag emerged from a ruined building, moving slowly toward American positions. American soldiers held their fire, watching in disbelief as the medic walked into the middle of the street. He knelt beside a wounded American soldier who had been lying there for hours, checked his wounds, and began bandaging them. For 10 minutes, the firing stopped in that sector. American and German soldiers watched as the medic worked, treating the American casualty with the same care he would have given a German. When he finished, he picked up the wounded American and carried him to the American lines, laid him down gently, and walked back to German positions. The firing did not resume for another 30 minutes. It was a brief moment of humanity in mechanized hell, proof that even in the worst circumstances, some men remembered they were human. By 4 o'clock in the morning, both sides were approaching the absolute limit of human endurance. Soldiers had been fighting for nearly 48 hours with almost no sleep. They were running on adrenaline and fear, their bodies functioning on autopilot while their minds became increasingly disconnected from reality. Men fell asleep in their positions, even under artillery fire, their bodies simply shutting down from exhaustion. Others experienced hallucinations, seeing movement where there was none, hearing orders that were never given. The fog of war became literal as exhaustion and fear made it impossible to trust one's senses. Officers struggled to keep their men alert, walking through positions, shaking sleeping soldiers, trying to maintain some level of combat effectiveness. The period from 4:30 to 5 o'clock in the morning was completely silent. It was the strangest moment of the entire battle. For 30 minutes, neither side fired a shot. The artillery stopped. The small arms fire ceased. Even the wounded stopped crying out. Both armies were simply too exhausted to continue. American soldiers stood in their positions, weapons ready, waiting for the attack that did not come. German soldiers did the same, waiting for orders that did not arrive. In the aid stations, medics used the silence to work on the most critical casualties, knowing it would not last. In command posts, officers tried to take stock, to figure out what they still held, what had been lost, who was still alive. The silence was more unnerving than the combat had been, because in the silence, men had time to think about what they had survived and what might still be coming. Dawn came slowly on December 18th, light creeping over the ruined villages like a reluctant witness. As visibility improved, the full scale of the destruction became clear. Buildings that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. Streets were cratered and blocked with debris. Bodies lay everywhere, American and German, some in the open where they had fallen, others visible through broken walls and shattered windows. Destroyed tanks sat at intersections, some still burning. The snow was no longer white, but stained red and black with blood and soot. It looked like the end of the world, but the defensive perimeter still held. The Americans still controlled Krinkelt and Rocherath. The Germans had thrown everything at these positions for 2 days and 2 nights, and they had not broken through. The longest night was over. The survivors looked at each other in the gray dawn light, seeing faces aged by trauma, eyes hollow with exhaustion. They had endured something that should have broken them, but they had not broken. They had held. December 18th, 1944, 9 o'clock in the morning. At V Corps headquarters, 15 miles behind the front lines, Major General Leonard Giraud stood over a map table studying aerial reconnaissance photographs that had arrived an hour earlier. The photos showed the road network through the Ardennes with a clarity that ground-level reports could never provide. Giraud had been a Corps commander long enough to read terrain like a book, and what he was seeing made his blood run cold. There were only 8 paved roads through the entire northern Ardennes, capable of supporting 60-ton Tiger tanks. 3 of those roads converged at Krinkelt-Rocherath. Every alternate route the Germans might use crossed rivers on bridges, rated for only 30 tons, or wound through forest trails that would turn to impassable mud under the weight of armored vehicles. His staff officers had been telling him for 2 days that Krinkelt-Rocherath was just another village, that the important fighting was happening elsewhere. They were wrong. This village was the key to everything. The revelation had been building slowly. On December 16th, when the German offensive began, V Corps had focused on the bigger picture, the entire 90-mile front under attack, the multiple breakthroughs, the need to rush reinforcements everywhere simultaneously. Krinkelt-Rocherath was just one problem among many, and not obviously the most critical. But as reports came in over the next 48 hours, a pattern emerged. German forces were hammering these villages with intensity that seemed disproportionate. Elite SS units were being committed, taking heavy casualties, achieving nothing. The Germans were paying a price that made no sense unless those villages were absolutely critical to their plan. General Giraud called for detailed maps of the road network and began to understand why. At German Army Group B headquarters, the same realization was producing desperation. Staff officers tallied reports from 6th SS Panzer Army and saw the offensive dying on the road network. The 12th SS Panzer Division reported 47 tanks lost or damaged in 2 days of fighting at the twin villages, losses they could not sustain. The 277th Volksgrenadier Division was combat ineffective, having taken over 30% casualties. Piper's Kampfgruppe, the spearhead that was supposed to reach Antwerp, was cut off and running out of fuel. Every alternative route was creating delays and burning. Gasoline that was supposed to carry German armor to the Meuse. The northern thrust of the offensive, which Hitler had intended as the main effort, was grinding to a halt because 2 villages refused to fall. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. German planning had calculated that Piper's Kampfgruppe, traveling on paved roads at an average speed of 20 miles per hour, could reach the Meuse River in 3 days. That calculation assumed the roads would be clear, that resistance would be minimal, that the timetable would hold. Instead, Piper had been forced onto secondary roads where his column could only move in single file at 5 miles per hour. The detour added 30 miles to his route. Fuel consumption went from 5 gallons per mile to 8 gallons per mile because of the difficult terrain and constant maneuvering. Simple arithmetic showed that these delays were catastrophic. By December 18th, Piper should have been crossing the Meuse. Instead, he was fighting for his survival 40 miles short of the river. The road network's importance went beyond simple movement. Modern mechanized warfare required massive logistical support. A single panzer division needed hundreds of tons of supplies per day: ammunition, fuel, food, spare parts, medical supplies. Those supplies had to move forward on the same roads the combat units were using. When the roads were blocked or limited to single-lane traffic, the entire supply system collapsed. German units that reached their objectives found themselves out of ammunition and fuel because supply trucks could not get through. The twin villages, by controlling the best road network, had become a logistical choke point that was strangling the offensive more effectively than any direct military action could have. American commanders began to grasp the strategic implications. If Krinkelt-Rocherath could hold for another day or two, if the northern shoulder of the German penetration could be contained, the entire offensive would be compressed into a narrow salient. Instead of a broad breakthrough that split the Allied armies, the Germans would create a bulge that could be attacked from three sides. But holding required more than just brave soldiers. It required a decision that General Giraud found almost impossible to make. The 2nd and 99th Divisions were running low on ammunition. Casualties were mounting. The Germans were committing fresh units. At some point, probably soon, the defense would collapse not from lack of courage, but from simple mathematics. More Germans than Americans, more shells than the defenders could withstand, more attacks than exhausted men could repel. At noon on December 18th, Giraud made his decision. The twin villages would be evacuated. The 2nd and 99th Divisions would withdraw 3 miles west to Elsenborn Ridge, where they could establish a stronger defensive line with better fields of fire and closer artillery support. Staff. Officers began drafting the withdrawal order, calculating timing, designating routes, assigning rear guard units. It was the right decision strategically. Elsenborn Ridge was a better position, easier to defend, harder for the Germans to assault. But it meant abandoning the ground that thousands of men had fought for over the past 3 days. It meant leaving wounded behind. It meant giving up villages that had become symbols of American resistance. The order went out at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Prepare to withdraw at nightfall. The German High Command learned about the American withdrawal through radio intercepts and prisoner interrogations. The reaction was complex. On one hand, capturing the twin villages after 3 days of fighting was a victory, proof that German forces could still defeat the Americans. On the other hand, it was 3 days too late. The timetable was destroyed. The northern offensive had failed. Field Marshal Model, commanding Army Group B, knew the truth even if he could not say it openly. The offensive was over. German forces could still advance, could still inflict casualties, could still capture territory, but they could not reach Antwerp. They could not split the Allied armies. They could not change the strategic situation. The Battle of Krinkelt-Rocherath had determined the outcome of the larger battle before most people even understood what was happening. The road network that both sides had fought over with such intensity would remain in American hands throughout the rest of the war. After withdrawing to Elsenborn Ridge, American forces established a defensive line that never broke. The northern shoulder held firm, compressing the German offensive into the narrow salient that would give the battle its name, the Battle of the Bulge. German forces pushed west in the center, creating a bulge in the Allied lines that looked dangerous on maps, but was actually a trap. Every mile the Germans advanced, their supply lines stretched longer. Every day the offensive continued. Allied reinforcements grew stronger. By December 24th, the weather cleared, and Allied aircraft filled the skies, destroying German columns with impunity. By December 26th, Patton's Third Army relieved Bastogne from the south. By early January, the Bulge was being erased. German forces pushed back through the same territory they had captured at such cost. The roads through Krinkelt-Rocherath, the roads that mattered more than anyone initially understood, remained under American control. They carried supplies forward to American units, evacuated wounded to rear area hospitals, and brought reinforcements to the front. The Germans never used them. The paved road network that was supposed to carry German armor to the Meuse River and Antwerp instead carried American trucks and jeeps, supporting the counteroffensive that would eventually push into Germany itself. 3 days of desperate fighting over 2 small villages had determined which army would control the roads, and with them, the outcome of Germany's last great offensive. The strategic importance had been hidden in plain sight all along, visible on maps to anyone who knew how to read them. By the time both sides understood what they were really fighting for, the battle was already decided. December 18th, 1944, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Major General Walter Robertson, commander of the 2nd Infantry Division, read the withdrawal order from Vice Corps with emotions he could not entirely name. Relief that his men would be pulled out of that meat grinder. Anger that they were being ordered to give up ground they had held at such terrible cost. Dread at what the withdrawal would require, moving thousands of men out of contact with the enemy, in darkness, while under fire, leaving behind wounded who could not walk. He called his staff officers together in the command post, a stone basement that shook with each artillery impact. They had 6 hours to plan a withdrawal that normally would take days to organize. Outside, soldiers were still fighting and dying for villages they would abandon before dawn. Robertson began issuing orders, his voice steady, despite the weight of what he was commanding. The plan was necessarily simple. The withdrawal would begin at nightfall, approximately 6 o'clock in the evening, and be completed by 2 in the morning. Units would disengage in sequence, with rear guards holding positions while the main force pulled back. The destination was Elsenborn Ridge, 3 miles to the west, where engineers were already preparing defensive positions. Artillery would provide continuous fire support, keeping German forces suppressed, while American infantry withdrew. Roads were designated for different units to prevent traffic jams. Everything that could be done to ensure an orderly withdrawal was being done. But Robertson and his staff knew the truth. In combat, plans fell apart the moment they encountered reality. Men would get lost in the darkness. Units would be cut off. Germans would attack during the withdrawal. Some soldiers would not make it out. Company commanders received the order at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and had to break the news to their men. Captain James McKenna of Company G, 2nd Division, gathered his survivors, 40 men left from a company that had started the battle with 190, and told them they were pulling out at 6. The reaction was not what he expected. Some men were relieved, grateful to be leaving the nightmare, but others were angry, feeling like they were abandoning their dead, giving the Germans a victory after holding for 3 days. A sergeant stood up and asked the question everyone was thinking. "What about the wounded, sir? The ones who can't walk?" McKenna had no good answer. The order was clear. Wounded who could walk would be evacuated. Those who could not would be left behind with medics who volunteered to stay. The silence that followed was the worst moment of the war for everyone in that basement. At the aid stations, medics faced impossible choices. They had over 200 wounded men, far more than could be evacuated in the time available. The walking wounded would go first. Men with arm wounds, leg wounds that still allowed movement, men who could make it to the trucks under their own power. Then came the litter cases who had a chance of surviving transport. That still left dozens of men too badly wounded to move, men who would die if they were loaded onto trucks and driven over rough roads, men who needed surgery and care that could only be provided by staying in place. Medical officers went through the agonizing process of triage, deciding who would be evacuated and who would be left behind. The men being left behind understood what it meant. They would become prisoners if the Germans honored the Red Cross. They would die if the Germans did not. Volunteers to stay behind came forward immediately. Medics who could have evacuated chose to remain with the men who could not be moved. A chaplain from the 99th Division refused to leave, saying he would stay with the wounded regardless of what happened. 2 doctors volunteered to stay rather than leave their patients. These were not dramatic decisions made for show. They were quiet choices made in basements and ruined buildings. Men deciding that their duty to wounded soldiers outweighed their duty to save themselves. No speeches were made, no medals were promised. They simply stayed because leaving felt like abandonment, and they could not live with that choice. The withdrawal began at 6 o'clock as darkness fell. Units started disengaging from their positions, moving back through pre-designated routes. The rear guard, composed of volunteers from both divisions, took up positions to cover the withdrawal. These men knew they were being asked to hold until everyone else was clear, which meant they would be the last ones out, the most likely to be cut off if something went wrong. They accepted the mission without complaint. Staff Sergeant William Peterson, who had landed at Omaha Beach on D-Day and survived campaigns across France, found himself in charge of a rear guard position in Rocherath. He watched the main force pull back and settled in with his squad to hold for as long as necessary. They had ammunition for maybe 2 hours of sustained combat. After that, they would have to run for it. The Germans detected the withdrawal almost immediately. Radio intercepts, observation posts, and simple battlefield awareness told German commanders that the Americans were pulling out. The question was whether to attack during the withdrawal, trying to turn it into a rout, or to let the Americans go and simply occupy the villages. Different German units made different choices. Some launched immediate attacks, trying to break through the rear guard. Others held position, content to have achieved the objective of capturing the twin villages, even if 3 days late. The result was confused fighting across the entire withdrawal route, with some American units escaping cleanly, while others fought running battles all the way back to Elsenborn Ridge. Peterson's rear guard position came under attack at 10 o'clock. German infantry, probing forward to test American resolve, ran into concentrated fire from the defenders. Peterson's squad held for 30 minutes, then pulled back to a secondary position as planned. They held there for another 20 minutes, then pulled back again. It was textbook retrograde action, trading space for time, making the Germans pay for every yard while maintaining unit cohesion. But ammunition was running low, and German pressure was increasing. At 11:30, Peterson made the decision to abandon the position and make a run for American lines. His squad sprinted through the darkness, German fire following them. 2 men hit and carried by their squad mates. They reached friendly positions at midnight, the last organized unit to make it out of Rocherath. By 2 o'clock in the morning, on December 19th, the withdrawal was complete. The last American soldiers slipped out of Krinkelt-Rocherath and made their way to Elsenborn Ridge. Behind them, the twin villages were in flames, buildings burning from artillery, and the fires started by retreating soldiers to deny the Germans shelter. German troops moved cautiously into the ruins, expecting ambushes, finding only destruction and the wounded left behind. At the aid stations, German medics found American medical personnel caring for casualties. Most of the German units honored the Red Cross and allowed the medical work to continue. The wounded became prisoners, but they lived. The medics and doctors who stayed behind would spend the rest of the war in German POW camps, but they had saved lives and honored their oaths. The new defensive line at Elsenborn Ridge was everything the twin villages were not. High ground with clear fields of fire, good artillery positions, prepared defenses. The exhausted soldiers of the 2nd and 99th Divisions moved into positions that had been dug by engineers, positions that actually made tactical sense. For the first time in 3 days, they were in a place where their defensive advantages outweighed German offensive power. Officers walked the lines, checking positions, redistributing ammunition that had been moved forward during the withdrawal. Hot food arrived, the first many men had eaten in 2 days. Medics moved through the positions, treating minor wounds that had been ignored during the fighting. The men were still in combat, still at risk, but they were no longer in the grinder. They had survived Krinkelt-Rocherath. The cost would be tallied later. December 19th, 1944, afternoon. Captain Robert Jensen of the Graves Registration Service entered Krinkelt for the first time since the American withdrawal and stopped in the street, overwhelmed by what he was seeing. Bodies lay everywhere. American soldiers in their distinctive uniforms, German soldiers in field gray, some in groups where they had died together, others isolated where they had fallen alone. The snow was stained red across entire blocks. Destroyed vehicles sat at every intersection, some still burning 3 days after being hit. Buildings had collapsed onto the bodies of men sheltering inside. The smell was indescribable, even in the freezing temperatures. Burned flesh, cordite, decay already beginning despite the cold. Jensen had seen battlefields before, had processed casualties from D-Day and the hedgerow fighting. This was worse. This had been apocalyptic. The American casualty count began at the aid stations behind Elsenborn Ridge. Medics compiled lists of the wounded who had been evacuated, men with injuries ranging from minor shrapnel wounds to amputations, burns, and sucking chest wounds. 650 dead were confirmed. Their bodies either recovered during the withdrawal or left behind in the villages. Another 1,400 were listed as wounded, dead, or missing, though many of the missing would eventually be confirmed as killed in action. For the 99th Division, fighting its first battle, the casualty rate approached 20%. For the 2nd Division, which had been through Normandy and across France, this 3-day battle produced losses comparable to entire weeks of the hedgerow fighting. Company rosters told the story in stark terms. Company K of the 394th Regiment entered the battle with 190 men. 53 answered roll call on December 19th. The medics who processed these casualties documented wounds that told the story of modern warfare's industrial violence. Shell fragments caused the majority of injuries. jagged pieces of steel moving at supersonic speeds, tearing through flesh and bone, causing wounds that were difficult to treat and slow to heal. High-velocity rifle bullets created their own category of destruction, punching through bodies and creating massive exit wounds. Tank main gun rounds, designed to penetrate armor, had hit buildings where American soldiers were sheltering, the kinetic energy turning human bodies into component parts that barely resembled what they had been. Burns were common, from fires in buildings, from vehicle explosions, from phosphorus shells. Frostbite added to the toll, soldiers who had fought for hours in below freezing temperatures suffering damage to hands and feet that would require amputations. One medic kept a journal that survived the war. On December 19th, he wrote, "I stopped counting after 200. After that, they were just bodies. Arms and legs in aid station, men screaming, men quiet who should be screaming, doing surgery with a knife and pliers. No morphine left, no plasma left, no hope left. They keep coming. I keep working. What else can I do?" The journal entries became shorter each day. The emotional capacity to process what he was seeing deteriorating as the casualties mounted. By December 21st, his entries were single sentences. More. Too many. God help us. The psychological wounds of the medical personnel who processed this industrial scale of human destruction would never fully heal. German casualties were harder to document, but no less catastrophic. Prisoner interrogations and captured German medical records suggested 1,800 killed and over 3,000 wounded or captured. The 12th SS Panzer Division, which entered the battle with 22,000 men, was reduced to 16,000 effectives by December 19th. The 277th Volksgrenadier Division was essentially destroyed as a fighting force, having taken losses that made it combat ineffective. German military doctrine classified a unit as combat ineffective when casualties exceeded 30%. The 277th had lost over 40% of its strength. Units from this division would be pulled from the line and would not participate in further offensive operations. The tank losses told their own story. American forces documented German armor destroyed in and around the twin villages. 47 Panzer IV tanks, each weighing 25 tons and carrying a crew of 5. 23 Panther tanks, at 45 tons the backbone of German armored forces, and 19 assault guns and tank destroyers. The Panthers were particularly devastating losses because Germany's production capacity could not replace them. Each Panther took approximately 6 months to manufacture and required skilled labor that Germany no longer had in sufficient quantities. The 48 hours of fighting at Krinkelt-Rocherath destroyed approximately 2 years of Panther production. The Germans could not sustain that rate of attrition. The Americans, with their industrial capacity and supply lines intact, could. But numbers on casualty reports did not capture the human reality. Private James Cooper, who had knocked out that first Panther tank in Krinkelt, was among the dead, killed by artillery fire on December 18th. Staff Sergeant William Peterson, the Omaha Beach veteran who had led the rear guard out of Rocherath, lost his right leg below the knee to a German mine during the withdrawal. Lieutenant Colonel McClernand Butler, the lawyer-turned-regiment commander who had briefed his officers 3 days earlier in a world that seemed impossibly distant, was wounded by shell fragments and evacuated. Hundreds of individual stories ended or were permanently changed in those 3 days. The battalion commander who held together his unit's defense despite being wounded 3 times. The medic who treated 40 casualties before being killed by a sniper. The tank destroyer gunner who killed 5 German tanks before his vehicle was destroyed. History would remember the battle. Few would remember these names. The wounded who survived faced their own battles. Field hospitals behind the lines performed emergency surgery, trying to stabilize men for the long evacuation to rear area hospitals in France or England. Many would lose limbs, the damage too extensive to repair with the medical technology of 1944. Others would carry shell fragments in their bodies for the rest of their lives. Metal pieces too dangerous to remove or too deep to reach. Burns left scars that decades of skin grafts would never fully erase. Head wounds left men with seizures, personality changes, cognitive impairments that turned them into strangers to their families. The butcher's bill was not just paid in the dead, but in the living who would never be whole again. In late January 1945, after American forces reoccupied the twin villages, graves registration teams returned to complete their work. They found bodies that had been buried by snow and preserved by the cold. They found bodies in basements where men had sheltered and died. They found bodies in destroyed tanks, the crews killed instantly by penetrating shots, or burned alive when ammunition exploded. Each body was documented, photographed, searched for identification, dog tags were collected, personal effects inventoried, burial locations recorded. The work took weeks. Over 400 American bodies were eventually recovered from the immediate area of the twin villages. Many were never identified, their dog tags lost, their faces destroyed by wounds or exposure. They were buried as unknown U.S. Army. The Germans did the same for their dead, collecting bodies when possible, burying them in temporary graves, leaving markers that would later guide permanent burial details. The final accounting would show that the Battle of Krinkelt-Rocherath cost approximately 2,000 American casualties and 5,000 German casualties. In the calculus of military effectiveness, this represented a stunning defensive success. The Germans, attacking with numerical superiority and the advantage of surprise, had suffered more than twice the casualties of the defenders. They had lost irreplaceable armor and veteran troops while gaining only 2 ruined villages that they could not use. The Americans had lost soldiers they could replace and had bought time that changed the entire strategic situation. But these calculations meant nothing to the men who had been there, to the survivors who woke screaming from nightmares, to the families who would never see their sons and husbands again. The butcher's bill was paid in blood and trauma, and the men who survived would carry the cost for the rest of their lives. December 19th, 1944. Dawn. The soldiers of the 2nd and 99th Divisions who had withdrawn from Krinkelt-Rocherath during the night found themselves on Elsenborn Ridge, and even in their exhaustion, they recognized the difference. The ridge rose 600 feet above the surrounding terrain, a long slope that commanded fields of fire stretching for miles. From the crest, they could see the twin villages burning in the distance, smoke rising into the gray winter sky. They could see the roads the Germans would have to use to advance. They could see everything, and the Germans attacking uphill would be exposed with every step. Engineers had been working for 24 hours preparing positions. Foxholes dug into the frozen earth, machine gun emplacements with overlapping fields of fire, communication trenches connecting strong points. This was what a defensive position should look like. This was where they would make their stand. The transformation from chaos to order was remarkable. At Krinkelt-Rocherath, the defense had been improvised, desperate, a matter of making do with buildings and streets, never designed for combat. At Elsenborn Ridge, everything was deliberate. Artillery positions were surveyed and registered, meaning American gunners had precise coordinates for every likely German avenue of approach. Forward observers had clear sight lines to call fire. Communication wire was buried to protect it from artillery. Ammunition caches were distributed throughout the defensive area, ensuring that no position would run dry. Supply routes were established and protected, meaning hot food and ammunition could move forward under relatively safe conditions. It was military engineering at its finest, a position that multiplied defensive strength through terrain and preparation. The artillery concentration at Elsenborn Ridge was the largest in the European theater. Over 200 guns, 105mm howitzers, 155mm guns, massive 8-inch howitzers, even a few 240mm guns that could hurl 360-pound shells, were positioned in mutually supporting batteries. Fire direction centers coordinated their efforts, allowing the Americans to mass fires on any point with devastating effect. German commanders who had grown accustomed to artillery superiority on the Eastern Front now faced American artillery doctrine that emphasized massed fires and rapid response. A German battalion forming up to attack could find itself under fire from 30 guns within minutes of being spotted. The psychological effect was as important as the physical destruction. The first German probing attacks came on December 20th. Small units, reconnaissance elements from the 12th SS Panzer Division, advanced toward the ridge to test American positions and find weaknesses. They found none. American infantry held their fire until the Germans were well within range, then opened up with rifles and machine guns. Simultaneously, artillery observers called for fire, and within minutes, shells were falling on the German assault. The probing attacks were driven back with heavy casualties and minimal American losses. German commanders realized they were facing a completely different tactical situation than they had encountered at the Twin Villages. This was not going to be a matter of grinding through street by street. This would require a deliberate assault against prepared positions, and they no longer had the strength for it. On December 22nd, the Germans launched a major assault, committing fresh troops from the 12th S Panzer Division and the 326th Volksgrenadier Division. The attack began with an artillery barrage, German guns firing everything they had left at the American positions. Then, infantry advanced in waves, supported by the few remaining tanks. They advanced into a meat grinder. American artillery, firing on pre-registered coordinates, fell among the attacking Germans with precision. Machine guns positioned on the ridge opened fire at maximum effective range, 600 yards, cutting down infantry before they even reached the base of the slope. The few German tanks that made it close to American positions were destroyed by tank destroyers and bazooka teams firing from prepared positions. The attack lasted 4 hours and achieved nothing. German casualty estimates range from 800 to over 1,000 killed and wounded. American casualties were fewer than 100. The Germans tried again on December the 23rd and again on December 24th. Each attack followed the same pattern: artillery barrage, infantry assault, devastating American defensive fires, German withdrawal. The casualty ratios were catastrophic for the Germans. At Krinkelt-Rocherath, they had suffered roughly 2-to-1 casualty ratios. At Elsenborn Ridge, the ratio was closer to 10-to-1 in the Americans' favor. German units that had survived the fighting in the twin villages were being destroyed in futile attacks on positions they had no hope of taking. By Christmas Eve, German commanders stopped even trying. The northern shoulder had held. The American defensive line from Elsenborn Ridge extending south had created a wall that compressed the entire German offensive into a narrow salient. The weather on December 23rd brought a gift to the defenders. The overcast skies that had grounded Allied aircraft since December 16th finally cleared. Within hours, the sky was filled with American and British aircraft. P-47, Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs strafed German columns, their .50 caliber machine guns shredding vehicles and infantry caught in the open. Medium bombers hit German supply dumps and headquarters. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed German positions and movements, providing intelligence that made American artillery even more effective. The Germans, who had counted on bad weather to neutralize Allied air superiority, now found themselves defenseless against attacks from above. Vehicle columns that tried to move during daylight were destroyed. Troops caught in the open were massacred. The Germans were forced to move only at night, which slowed their already stalled offensive even further. The soldiers holding Elsenborn Ridge watched the air attacks with grim satisfaction. They had fought without air support for a week, had endured German artillery without the ability to strike back at German positions beyond artillery range. Now they could see German vehicles burning in the distance, could watch enemy positions being hit by bombs and rockets, could listen to radio reports of German columns being destroyed. It was not revenge. Soldiers who had lived through Krinkelt-Rocherath were too exhausted for that emotion, but it was justice. The Germans had thrown everything at them and failed. Now the Germans were paying the price for that failure. By December 26th, the strategic situation had shifted completely. Patton's Third Army relieved Bastogne from the south, breaking the German encirclement and threatening the southern flank of the German salient. The northern shoulder at Elsenborn Ridge had never moved, containing the German offensive and preventing any breakthrough toward the Meuse River. The Germans were now trapped in a salient extended into Allied territory, with both flanks exposed, their supply lines under constant air attack, their offensive strength exhausted. Hitler ordered his forces to continue attacking, to reach the Meuse at any cost. His generals knew it was impossible. The offensive was over. All that remained was the withdrawal and the accounting of what had been lost. The men on Elsenborn Ridge did not celebrate. They were too tired, too traumatized, too aware of how close it had been. If the twin villages had fallen on December 16th, as the Germans planned, if Piper had broken through on schedule, if the northern shoulder had collapsed, the entire Battle of the Bulge might have ended differently. The ridge they now held would have been outflanked. The road network opened, German armor pouring west. But the villages had not fallen. The schedule had been broken. The shoulder had held. And now, from their positions on the ridge, American soldiers watched as the German offensive died in the fields below, its corpse decorated with destroyed vehicles and frozen bodies. The Elsenborn shield had held, and in holding, had saved more than just the soldiers who fought there. It had saved the entire Allied position in the Ardennes. December 26, 1944, late afternoon. Private First Class Robert MacDonald of the 99th Division sat in a foxhole on Elsenborn Ridge, eating hot food for the first time in days, when a soldier from the 2nd Division dropped into the foxhole beside him. Staff Sergeant William Peterson, who had lost his right leg during the withdrawal from Rocherath and returned to duty on crutches against medical orders, offered MacDonald a cigarette. They sat in silence for a while, two men who barely knew each other, but who shared an experience that no one else could understand. Finally, Peterson spoke. "You boys did good back there," he said quietly. "Real good. I've been in this war since Omaha Beach, and I've never seen men fight harder." MacDonald, who had been terrified every moment of the battle, who still shook when artillery fire came close, looked at the sergeant with something like wonder. The veterans of the 2nd Division were calling them good soldiers. The college boys who everyone had expected to run had earned the respect of men who had seen the worst this war could offer. The relationship between the 2nd and 99th Divisions had started with condescension and jokes. The veterans of the 2nd looked at the green troops of the 99th and saw inexperience, naivety, soldiers who had never been tested. The men of the 99th looked at the 2nd Division veterans and saw everything they feared they could never become: hard, experienced, confident. But 3 days at Krinkelt-Rocherath had changed everything. The veterans discovered that inexperience was not the same as cowardice, that green troops could learn faster than anyone expected, that courage was not something bestowed by prior combat, but something that emerged when men were tested. The men of the 99th discovered that they could fight, that they could endure, that the veterans bled and feared and struggled, just like everyone else. The casualty statistics told a story that military analysts would study for decades. The 99th Division entered combat on December 16th, with zero combat experience. By December 19th, they had suffered 20% casualties, but had held their positions against veteran German troops. The 2nd Division, with months of combat experience, suffered similar percentage losses while fighting beside the 99th. In after-action reports, V Corps officers noted that there was no significant difference in combat effectiveness between the two divisions during the battle. Both had held. Both had inflicted disproportionate casualties on the Germans. Both had accomplished their mission. The myth that only veteran units could hold against determined attacks was shattered by the performance of soldiers who had never heard a shot fired in anger before December 16th. The bond that formed between the divisions was unique in military history. Usually, veteran and green units were kept separate, the veterans mentoring the newcomers through their first battles before the units moved on to different sectors. But the 2nd and 99th had fought together in the most desperate circumstances, intermingled at platoon and company level, shared foxholes and ammunition and the absolute terror of modern combat. They had saved each other's lives countless times. A veteran machine gun team from the 2nd Division had held a street corner while a company from the 99th withdrew. A tank destroyer crew from the 99th had knocked out a German tank that was about to destroy a 2nd Division position. These were not abstractions, but specific memories, faces and names, debts that could never be repaid. The officers formalized what the enlisted men already understood. Joint memorial services were held for the dead of both divisions. When recommendations for medals were submitted, 2nd Division officers recommended 99th soldiers and vice versa. Company commanders who had argued during the battle now worked together to document the actions of soldiers from both units, ensuring that courage was recognized regardless of which division patch the men wore. 7 Distinguished Service Crosses, the nation's second highest award for valor, were awarded for actions at Krinkelt-Rocherath, split almost evenly between the two divisions. Dozens of Silver Stars and Bronze Stars followed. The medals were not just recognition of individual courage, but acknowledgement that the two divisions had fought as one. The veterans' reunions that began after the war were unlike those of other divisions. The 2nd and 99th insisted on joint gatherings, refusing to commemorate the battle separately. The first reunion was held in 1946 in St. Louis, and over 300 veterans from both divisions attended. They walked through the hotel lobby, seeing old friends, embracing men they had not seen since the war, sharing stories that only another survivor could understand. The reunions continued annually for decades, growing larger in the 1950s and 60s, as veterans became more comfortable talking about their experiences, then slowly shrinking as age took its toll. But the joint nature never changed. A 2nd Division veteran would stand up and tell a story about a 99th soldier who had saved his life. A 99th veteran would describe the moment a 2nd Division sergeant had shown him how to survive. The division between veteran and inexperienced had been erased by fire. Military historians studied the battle, trying to understand how Green troops had performed so well. Some pointed to leadership. The 99th had competent officers who made good tactical decisions under pressure. Others emphasized the defensive terrain and the support of the 2nd Division veterans. But the veterans themselves had a simpler explanation. When men are fighting for their lives and the lives of their brothers, when retreat means death and surrender means massacre, when every moment is a choice between enduring and dying, experience matters less than will. The men of the 99th had discovered that they had the will to fight, and once they made that discovery, they were no longer green. They were soldiers, as veteran as anyone who had landed at Normandy, tested by the same fire, and proven in the same crucible. The bond extended to the families of the dead. Widows of 2nd Division soldiers attended memorial services with widows of 99th Division soldiers, children who grew up without. Fathers found themselves part of a community that transcended the specific units their fathers had served in. The divisions created scholarship funds for the children of their dead, administered jointly, refusing to distinguish between whose father had worn which patch. The community of survivors became a community of families, bound together by shared loss and shared pride in what their husbands and fathers had accomplished. In the 1990s, as the veterans entered their 70s and 80s, oral history projects began recording their memories. Interviewers noticed a consistent pattern. Veterans from the 2nd Division, when asked about their combat experience, would often mention Krinkelt-Rocherath first, before D-Day, before the hedgerow fighting, before anything else. When asked why, they would explain that it was the battle where they learned that courage was not the exclusive property of veterans, that Green troops could fight just as hard as anyone. Veterans from the 99th, when asked about their most significant combat experience, would describe those 3 days as the moment they stopped being afraid that they could not measure up, the moment they learned they were as good as any soldiers in the army. Both groups would invariably mention the other division, the bond they felt, the respect that had been earned and given. The last joint reunion was held in 2004, 60 years after the battle. Fewer than 50 veterans attended, most in their 80s, some in wheelchairs, all carrying the physical marks of age. They gathered in a hotel conference room, looked at old photographs, told stories that had been told 100 times before. A veteran from the 2nd Division, speaking at the memorial service, said what they all felt. "We went into that battle as 2 divisions. We came out as brothers. That bond lasted our whole lives. I'm proud to have served with the 2nd Division, but I'm just as proud to have fought beside the 99th. They were the best soldiers I ever knew." The room was silent, except for the sound of old men crying, remembering friends who had not survived, remembering the moment when they discovered who they really were. The bond forged at Krinkelt-Rocherath had lasted 60 years and would last until the last survivor died. It was a bond written in blood and fire, and nothing in the peacetime years that followed could diminish it. March 1946, the United States Army Historical Division Building in Washington, D.C. Lieutenant Colonel S.L.A. Marshall, the Army's chief combat historian for the European theater, sat surrounded by documents. After-action reports, captured German records, prisoner interrogations, maps marked with unit movements, casualty figures, fuel consumption logs. He was writing the official history of the Battle of the Bulge, and the more he studied the evidence, the more convinced he became that the critical battle was not Bastogne, despite its fame, but the 3-day fight at Krinkelt-Rocherath that almost nobody outside the military had heard of. Marshall traced timelines with his finger, calculating how the 72-hour delay at the Twin Villages had cascaded through the entire German offensive, turning what might have been a strategic success into an inevitable failure. The conclusion was inescapable. The Battle of Krinkelt-Rocherath had decided the Battle of the Bulge before most people knew the offensive had begun. The German timetable had been rigid and unforgiving. 6th S Panzer Army was to break through the American front on December 16th, reach the Meuse River by December 20th, and be across the river advancing toward Antwerp by December 24th. The plan allowed for no delays, no setbacks, no contingencies. Everything had to work perfectly. The attack plan specified that Krinkelt-Rocherath would fall within 12 hours of the initial assault, clearing the way for Piper's armor to use the paved road network by late afternoon on December 16th. Instead, the villages held for 3 full days. Piper was forced to detour, burning fuel, losing time, alerting American forces all along his route. By December 20th, when he should have been crossing the Meuse, he was cut off and running out of supplies 40 miles short of the river. The offensive had failed on its own timeline. Marshall obtained German documents through the interrogation program that interviewed captured German officers. These documents revealed the internal German assessments of why the offensive failed. Multiple reports cited the unexpected resistance at Krinkelt-Rocherath as the critical failure. One German staff officer wrote, "The delay in securing the northern road network destroyed the timetable for 6th Panzer Army. All subsequent delays and failures can be traced to this initial setback. The American troops in these villages, initially assessed as inexperienced and likely to collapse, instead fought with determination that cost us 3 days we could not afford to lose." Another report noted, "The loss of 47 tanks in 3 days of fighting for 2 villages represented an attrition rate we could not sustain. These losses degraded our offensive capability to the point where breakthrough became impossible." The fuel accounting was particularly damning for the German plan. Germany had stockpiled fuel for the offensive based on the assumption that captured American supplies would supplement German reserves. The plan calculated that Piper's Kampfgruppe, traveling on the direct route through Krinkelt-Rocherath, would consume approximately 40,000 gallons of fuel to reach the Meuse. The actual consumption, traveling on inferior roads through detours, exceeded 65,000 gallons before Piper was cut off. That extra 25,000 gallons had to come from reserves intended for other units, degrading their operational capability. By December 20th, German units across the offensive were reporting critical fuel shortages. Some panzer divisions were immobilized, waiting for fuel that never came. The math was simple and brutal. The detour forced by the defense of Krinkelt-Rocherath had consumed fuel that the entire offensive could not afford to lose. The strategic effect of the northern shoulder holding firm became clear when Marshall plotted German and American positions on maps. The German offensive created a salient, a bulge in the Allied lines, that stretched 60 miles into Allied territory at its deepest point. But the bulge was only 20 miles wide at its base because the northern shoulder, anchored on Elsenborn Ridge, never moved. This created a situation where German forces had advanced deep but narrow, with both flanks exposed to counterattack. American forces could strike into the salient from 3 sides: from the north at Elsenborn, from the south, where Patton's Third Army was advancing, and eventually from the west as American forces stopped the German advance short of the Meuse. The geometry of the battlefield favored the defense because the northern shoulder had held. If Krinkelt-Rocherath had fallen on schedule, if Elsenborn Ridge had been outflanked, the salient would have been 50 miles wide at its base, giving the Germans room to maneuver and making Allied counterattacks far more difficult. Allied air power, which proved decisive in destroying the German offensive, was only effective because the weather cleared on December 23rd. But the weather clearing would have meant nothing if German forces had already reached the Meuse River. Aircraft flying from bases in France and England needed time to reach the Ardennes and conduct sustained operations. If German armor had crossed the Meuse on December 20th as planned, Allied air power would have been too late to stop the advance. Instead, when the weather cleared, German forces were still trapped in the Ardennes, still on the wrong side of the Meuse, perfect targets for aerial attack. Between December 23rd and December 26th, Allied aircraft flew over 5,000 sorties, destroying hundreds of German vehicles, interdicting supply routes, and making daylight movement impossible. This massive aerial campaign was only possible because the German offensive had been delayed long enough for the weather to change while German forces were still in the target zone. Marshall interviewed American commanders to understand their assessment of the battle's importance. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, stated in his interview, "The stand at Krinkelt-Rocherath and the subsequent defense of Elsenborn Ridge were critical to containing the German offensive. If those positions had fallen, the entire northern flank would have been compromised, and we would have faced a much more serious threat." General Omar Bradley, commanding 12th Army Group, was more direct. "Those boys at the bow, twin villages saved our bacon. They held when everyone expected them to run. And in holding, they wrecked the German timetable. Without that stand, we'd have been fighting a very different battle. V Corps Commander General Leonard Giraud, who had ordered the withdrawal from the villages, wrote in his after-action report, "The 2nd and 99th Divisions accomplished one of the most significant defensive actions of the war. Their sacrifice and determination provided the time necessary for us to establish a coherent defense." The German commanders who survived the war and were interviewed provided their own assessment. General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel, who commanded 5th Panzer Army in the center of the offensive, stated, "The northern attack was critical to the plan. When 6th Panzer Army failed to break through at Krinkelt-Rocherath and achieve its objectives, the entire offensive was compromised. We could not succeed in the center and south if the north failed." SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, interviewed in his war crimes trial, acknowledged, "The delay cost me the race. If the road network had been clear on schedule, I believe we could have reached the Meuse, but 3 days behind schedule, with the Americans alerted and reinforcing, it became impossible." German Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, committed suicide in April 1945, but his papers captured after the war included an assessment written in January. The offensive failed when 6th Panzer Army failed to break through in the first 48 hours. All subsequent efforts were attempting to achieve what had already become impossible. Marshall's final report concluded that the Battle of Krinkelt-Rocherath was the decisive engagement of the Battle of the Bulge, though it received little recognition at the time and remains overshadowed by the more famous fighting at Bastogne. He calculated that the 3-day delay imposed by the defense of the twin villages had added approximately 100 hours to the German advance timeline. Those 100 hours allowed American reinforcements to arrive, allowed defensive positions to be established, allowed Allied commanders to understand the scope of the German offensive and respond appropriately. Without that 100-hour buffer, Marshall calculated, German forces would likely have reached the Meuse River, possibly crossed it, and created a strategic crisis that would have extended the war by months. The cost of holding Krinkelt-Rocherath for 3 days was 2,000 American casualties. The cost of not holding it would have been incalculable. The strategic autopsy revealed a fundamental truth about the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's offensive failed not because it was badly conceived, the plan was actually quite good, but because it required perfect execution of a rigid timetable with no margin for error. The moment that timetable was disrupted at Krinkelt-Rocherath, the moment those first delays cascaded through the German command structure, the offensive was doomed. Everything that came after, Peiper's breakthrough and eventual encirclement, the siege of Bastogne, the ultimate American counteroffensive, was consequence flowing from that initial failure. The battle that decided the largest American engagement of World War II was not the famous siege that everyone remembered, but the 3-day grind in 2 Belgian villages that history nearly forgot. September 1998, the United States Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Professor James Harrison stood before a classroom of military officers taking advanced strategic studies and posed a question that had occupied military historians for decades. What if Krinkelt-Rocherath had fallen on December 16, 1944, as the Germans planned? The question was not idle speculation, but rigorous analysis, an attempt to understand what the defense of those villages had actually prevented. Harrison dimmed the lights and brought up a map showing German and Allied positions in December 1944. Then he began walking through the scenario, using actual German planning documents, fuel consumption data, Allied reinforcement timelines, and bridge capacity studies to model what would have happened if the northern shoulder had collapsed. The conclusion was both reassuring and terrifying. The German offensive would probably still have failed, but Allied casualties could have been catastrophic, and the war might have been extended by months. The first 24 hours would have changed dramatically. If the 277th Volksgrenadier Division had broken through the 99th Division's positions by noon on December 16th, Peiper's Kampfgruppe would have been on the road by 2 in the afternoon, using the paved route through Krinkelt-Rocherath exactly as planned. His column, moving at 15 to 20 miles per hour on good roads, could have covered 40 miles by nightfall. That would have put him past Ligneuville and approaching Stavelot by December 17th. The captured German operational plans specified that bridges at Stavelot and Trois Ponts were to be seized intact if possible, With American forces still unaware of the offensive's scale and direction, those bridges might have been taken before demolitions could be prepared. The fuel mathematics changed dramatically in this scenario. Piper's Kampfgruppe, traveling the planned route, would have consumed fuel at the planned rate, roughly 5 gallons per mile for the entire column. The direct route to the Meuse was approximately 90 miles. Total fuel consumption, 45,000 gallons. German fuel stocks in the offensive zone, sufficient to supply this consumption and still maintain reserves for follow-on forces. Compare this to the historical reality, where Piper's detour consumed over 65,000 gallons and left German forces critically short of fuel across the entire northern sector. In the counterfactual scenario, fuel would not have been the limiting factor. Piper would have had the supplies to reach the Meuse River, but reaching the Meuse did not mean crossing it. This was where the counterfactual scenario became more complex. The Meuse River in this sector was a significant obstacle, over 100 yards wide, flowing fast even in winter, with steep banks. The bridges capable of supporting 60-ton tanks were limited. Intelligence estimates from 1944 identified 3 bridges in Piper's sector, rated for heavy armor. All 3 were prepared for demolition, with explosives already in place and engineers assigned to blow them, if threatened. The question became, could Piper have captured one before it was destroyed? The answer depended on whether American commanders understood what was happening quickly enough to order the bridges blown preemptively. The American reinforcement timeline was critical to this analysis. Historically, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were rushed to the Ardennes and arrived in the Bastogne area by December 19th. In the counterfactual scenario, with Piper advancing rapidly toward the Meuse on December 17th and 18th, those airborne divisions would likely have been directed to the river crossings instead. Could they have arrived in time? The distances suggested no. The airborne divisions were stationed in France, over 100 miles from the Meuse crossings Piper was approaching. Even moving at maximum speed, they could not have reached defensive positions before December 19th. Piper, in this scenario, would have reached the river by late December 18th, over 12 hours before significant American reinforcements arrived. The bridge scenario split into 2 possibilities. In the first, American engineers, alerted to the German breakthrough, destroy the bridges before Piper arrives. He reaches the Meuse to find all crossings demolished. His Kampfgruppe, out of fuel and cut off from support, faces the same encirclement and destruction that occurred historically, just 40 miles further west. The offensive fails, but the psychological impact on Allied leadership is significant. German armor reached the Meuse. The offensive that everyone thought was impossible came within miles of success. Allied confidence is shaken. Plans for the final push into Germany are delayed. The war is extended by weeks, if not months. In the second possibility, Piper captures one bridge intact. This scenario was the nightmare that kept Allied commanders awake in December 1944. A German armored force across the Meuse, in the Allied rear area, with the road to Antwerp open. The immediate Allied response would be massive. Every available unit would be thrown at Piper's bridgehead. Aircraft would strike around the clock, regardless of weather. The fighting would be savage. The casualties on both sides enormous. Most analysis suggests that even with a bridge across the Meuse, Piper's isolated force could not have sustained itself for more than 48 hours. The fuel would run out. The ammunition would be exhausted. Allied forces would eventually destroy the bridgehead. But the cost would be measured in thousands of casualties, and the time required to eliminate the threat would give other German forces the opportunity to exploit the confusion. The critical question was whether German follow-on forces could have exploited Piper's breakthrough. The 12th SS Panzer Division and other German armored units were supposed to follow Piper's route, widening the breakthrough and establishing a sustainable corridor to the Meuse. In the historical battle, these units were tied down fighting at Krinkelt-Rocherath and never made it past the twin villages. In the counterfactual scenario, they would have been free to advance, but they faced the same problems that plagued the entire offensive: limited fuel, poor roads, and weather that would turn clear on December 23rd, exposing them to devastating air attack. Even if Piper crossed the Meuse, follow-on forces would likely have been destroyed by Allied aircraft before they could reinforce the bridgehead. The most rigorous analysis of the counterfactual suggested that the likely outcome was a deeper German penetration that resulted in a larger encirclement and ultimate destruction of German armored forces. Instead of losing Piper's Kampfgruppe 40 miles short of the Meuse, Germany would have lost Piper's force, plus follow-on units somewhere between the Meuse and Antwerp. The offensive still fails because the fundamental problems, limited fuel, Allied air superiority once weather cleared, insufficient forces to hold a corridor across 90 miles of hostile territory, could not be overcome. But the failure would have been more dramatic, the fighting more intense, and the Allied casualties significantly higher. The American casualty projections in this scenario were sobering. The historical Battle of the Bulge cost the United States approximately 19,000 killed, 47,000 wounded, and 23,000 captured or missing. If Piper had reached the Meuse and established a bridgehead, if follow-on German forces had advanced another 40 miles into Allied territory, if the battle to eliminate the penetration had required fighting in the Allied rear areas, American casualties would likely have exceeded 30,000 killed and 70,000 wounded. The additional weeks of fighting would have delayed the Allied advance into Germany, possibly extending the European War into May or June 1945, instead of ending in early May. The broader strategic implications extended beyond casualties and timelines. If German forces had reached the Meuse, even temporarily, the political impact on the Allied coalition would have been significant. Churchill and Roosevelt were already debating strategy for the final push into Germany. A major German success in December 1944 would have given Stalin additional leverage in those negotiations, potentially affecting the post-war division of Europe. The psychological impact on German civilians, who were being told daily that final victory was possible if they just held on, would have extended resistance and made the final defeat even more costly. Every additional week the war continued meant additional Holocaust victims, additional bombing casualties, additional suffering across Europe. The counterfactual analysis ultimately demonstrated what the defense of Krinkelt-Rocherath had actually achieved. It had not prevented a German victory. The offensive was probably doomed to failure regardless, due to fundamental logistical and strategic problems. But it had prevented a German penetration that would have cost tens of thousands of additional Allied casualties, extended the war by weeks or months, complicated the post-war political settlement, and inflicted immeasurable additional suffering. The 2,000 American casualties at Krinkelt-Rocherath had purchased something invaluable: the prevention of a much larger catastrophe. The men who fought there could not have known what they were preventing. They were just trying to survive, to hold their positions, to do their duty. But in doing so, they had saved more lives than they could have imagined. January 30th, 1945, 6 weeks after the battle ended. Captain Robert Jensen of Graves Registration returned to Krinkelt-Rocherath with a full platoon of men and a mission that would haunt them all. The villages were in Allied hands again, retaken during the grinding counteroffensive that had pushed German forces back to their start lines. But the cost of that counteroffensive was written across every street and building. 95% of Krinkelt was destroyed, buildings collapsed into rubble, walls blown down, roofs caved in, only foundations remaining to show where homes had stood. Rocherath was marginally better at 88% destroyed, a few stone walls still standing, a few cellars intact. The smell hit Jensen before his truck even entered the village, a sweet, sickly smell of decay that the winter cold could only slow, not stop. Bodies had been lying under snow for 6 weeks. Now they had to be found, identified, and buried with whatever dignity remained possible. The recovery teams worked systematically, moving through the ruins building by building, street by street. They found American bodies and German bodies, sometimes lying side by side where they had killed each other, sometimes buried under rubble from collapsed buildings. Dog tags were collected when present, but many bodies had no identification. Shell fragments and bullets had destroyed faces beyond recognition. Uniform scraps could indicate nationality, but not individual identity. The recovery teams photographed everything, documented the location of every body, searched for any personal effects that might aid in identification: wallets, letters, jewelry, anything that might tell them who this had been. Some bodies were never identified. They were designated unknown U.S. Army or unknown German soldier and buried in temporary graves pending final disposition. The aid station in Rocherath, where American medical personnel had stayed behind with the wounded, yielded both horror and relief. 89 American wounded had survived German captivity. The German medical personnel, honoring the Geneva Conventions, had provided basic care and shared limited supplies. The wounded were emaciated, some suffering from infections that had gone untreated, all bearing the psychological scars of weeks as prisoners. But they were alive. They were evacuated to field hospitals, treated for their wounds and malnutrition, and eventually sent home. The medics and doctors who had volunteered to stay behind were also recovered, gaunt from 6 weeks of captivity, but proud of what they had accomplished. They had saved lives by staying. They had honored their oaths. For the rest of their lives, they would be known among medical personnel as men who chose duty over safety. But not all the wounded had survived. Recovery teams found bodies in the aid stations, men who had died of their wounds in the weeks after the battle. They found bodies of soldiers who had been too badly wounded to move, left behind during the withdrawal, who had died alone in the cold. Some had been cared for by Belgian civilians who had hidden them from German patrols. Others had simply frozen to death in the ruins. Each body recovered was a story that ended badly, a family that would receive the telegram they had been dreading. The recovery teams handled each body with respect, understanding that this had been someone's son, someone's husband, someone's father. The work was physically and emotionally exhausting, but it was necessary. These men had died doing their duty. The least the army could do was bring them home. German prisoner interrogations provided their own insights into the battle's aftermath. SS prisoners from the 12th Panzer Division expressed shock at the resistance they had faced. One captured officer stated in interrogation, "We were told the Americans were inexperienced, that they would collapse under our first attack. Instead, they fought like veterans. We lost more men in 3 days at those villages than we lost in 2 weeks on the Eastern Front. It was suicide to advance." Enlisted prisoners told stories of units that entered the battle with full strength and emerged with barely half their men. They described the psychological impact of American artillery, the fear of American tank destroyers firing from concealed positions, the horror of fighting in villages where every building was a fortress. Many expressed relief at being captured, at being out of the war, at having survived. Belgian civilians returned to the ruins of their villages in late January and early February. They found homes that had stood for centuries reduced to rubble. Family possessions, furniture, clothing, photographs, the accumulated memories of generations, were destroyed or scattered. Livestock had been killed by artillery, or had starved when their owners fled. Fields that should have been planted were cratered and littered with unexploded ordnance. The civilians faced the prospect of rebuilding their lives from nothing, in the middle of winter, in a war zone that might become active again at any moment. The American military provided what aid it could: shelter in temporary structures, food rations, medical care, but the help was limited. The war was still ongoing, and military resources went to combat operations first. The reconstruction of Krinkelt and Rocherath would take 7 years. Rubble had to be cleared, unexploded ordnance removed, utilities restored. Buildings had to be reconstructed, often from scratch because the original structures were too damaged to repair. The Belgian government provided reconstruction funds, but the work was slow and difficult. Families who had lived in these villages for generations chose not to return, moving to cities or emigrating entirely. The population of the twin villages before the war was approximately 1,500. By 1952, when reconstruction was largely complete, the population was barely 900. The physical scars of the battle were eventually erased, but the community never fully recovered. Spring 1945 brought graves registration teams back to complete their work. The ground was no longer frozen, making it easier to recover bodies that had been buried by snow or trapped under rubble. They found 423 American bodies in the immediate area of the twin villages. They found over 800 German bodies, though the count was incomplete because German recovery efforts were minimal in the chaos of the war's final months. Each American body was transported to temporary cemeteries in Belgium, where they were prepared for shipment home or reburial in permanent American military cemeteries. The work continued through the summer, teams fanning out across the battlefield, finding bodies in foxholes and destroyed vehicles, in forests and fields, anywhere the fighting had reached. The survivors processed their trauma in different ways. Some spoke openly about what they had experienced, telling and retelling their stories to anyone who would listen. as if by speaking they could make sense of what they had endured. Others never spoke of it at all, carrying the memories in silence, waking from nightmares they could not explain to their families. Many developed what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, flashbacks to the battle, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, anger that seemed to come from nowhere. The Veterans Administration in 1945 had limited understanding of psychological trauma and limited resources to treat it. Many veterans simply suffered, drinking to numb the memories, isolating themselves from communities they could no longer relate to, struggling through lives that seemed hollow after the intensity of combat. Letters home from survivors tried to explain what they had experienced, with limited success. One soldier from the 99th Division wrote to his mother, "I can't describe what it was like. The noise, the fear, the cold. Men dying all around me, buildings exploding. I don't know how I survived. I don't know why I survived when so many didn't. I dream about it every night. I see their faces. I wake up and I'm back there, and it takes me minutes to remember that I'm home, that it's over. But it doesn't feel over. It feels like I'm still there, like I never left." The letter was typical of thousands written by survivors, attempts to bridge the unbridgeable gap between those who had been there and those who had not. By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe was over. Germany surrendered in May. The soldiers who had fought at Krinkelt-Rocherath were scattered, some participating in occupation duty in Germany, some redeployed to the Pacific Theater, some sent home to recover from wounds or because they had accumulated enough points for discharge. The battle became one memory among many, one engagement in a war that had lasted years and claimed millions of lives. Few people outside the military knew the names Krinkelt or Rocherath. The famous Battle of the Bulge was Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne had been surrounded and held out, where General McAuliffe had responded to a German surrender demand with "nuts." That was the story that captured public imagination. The 3-day grind in 2 Belgian villages that almost nobody had heard of faded from public consciousness. The survivors knew what they had accomplished, but the world was moving on, and they would have to carry their knowledge alone. December 1946, 2 years after the battle. Newspapers across America ran stories commemorating the Battle of the Bulge, the largest American engagement of World War II. The stories focused on Bastogne, on the 101st Airborne Division's heroic defense, on General Patton's dramatic relief of the surrounded garrison. There were photographs of snow-covered foxholes, of soldiers dug in around the town, of McAuliffe's famous message. 500 articles, features, and editorials recounted the siege and relief of Bastogne. Fewer than 50 mentioned Krinkelt-Rocherath. In a hotel room in St. Louis, a group of veterans from the 2nd and 99th Divisions read these newspapers and felt a profound sense of injustice. They had held the northern shoulder. They had stopped the main German thrust. They had fought just as hard as anyone at Bastogne, but history was forgetting them. The strategic reality told a different story than the public narrative. The northern shoulder, anchored initially at Krinkelt-Rocherath and then at Elsenborn Ridge, had contained 40% of German armored forces committed to the offensive. The 6th S Panzer Army, which was supposed to be the main effort of the entire operation, had been stopped cold by the 2nd and 99th Divisions. Bastogne, while important, had faced the 5th Panzer Army in the center of the German offensive, a supporting effort, not the main attack. Military analysts understood this. The Army's official histories, when they were finally published, acknowledged it. But public memory worked differently than official history. Bastogne had the better story: surrounded garrison, dramatic rescue, quotable general. Krinkelt-Rocherath was a complex defensive battle that prevented something from happening. Preventing disaster is less dramatic than surviving encirclement. The veterans refused to let their battle be forgotten. In 1969, 25 years after the battle, survivors from both divisions raised funds to place a memorial in Krinkelt. They traveled to Belgium, elderly men now, walking streets that had been rebuilt but that they remembered as ruins. They found the site where they had fought, where their friends had died, and they placed a stone marker. The inscription read, "In memory of the soldiers of the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, who fought here December 16 through 19, 1944, and held the northern shoulder of the Battle of the Bulge." Belgian villagers attended the dedication ceremony, remembering the Americans who had fought to defend their homes. The veterans stood in the cold Belgian winter, many crying, finally feeling like their sacrifice had been acknowledged. The annual December 17th ceremony became a tradition. Every year on the anniversary of the battle's worst day, veterans would gather at the memorial if they could travel, or hold local commemorations if they could not. They would read the names of the dead. They would tell stories about men who had fought beside them. They would explain to their children and grandchildren what had happened here, why it mattered, why it should not be forgotten. The ceremonies were small, rarely more than a few hundred people, nothing like the massive commemorations at Bastogne. But the veterans did not care about the size. They cared about the memory, about ensuring that their dead were not forgotten, that their fight was recognized. Military historians in the 1990s and 2000s began reassessing the Battle of the Bulge with access to documents that had been classified for decades. German operational plans, fuel consumption logs, after-action reports, Allied intelligence summaries, all of this material became available to researchers. The consensus that emerged from this new scholarship was clear. Krinkelt-Rocherath was one of the most important defensive actions of World War II. Professor John Keegan, in his comprehensive study of the battle published in 1995, wrote, "The fighting at the twin villages imposed a delay on German forces that proved catastrophic to their timetable. While Bastogne captured public imagination, Krinkelt-Rocherath determined the battle's outcome." Other historians echoed this assessment, providing the scholarly recognition that veterans had sought for decades. A small museum opened in Rocherath in 2003, housed in one of the few buildings that had survived the battle. The museum displayed artifacts recovered from the battlefield: helmets, weapons, personal items from American and German soldiers. Photographs showed the villages before, during, and after the battle. Oral history recordings played veterans' voices, describing what they had experienced. Touchscreens allowed visitors to explore tactical maps showing unit movements and defensive positions. The museum was modest, nothing like the massive facilities at other World War II battlefields, but it told the story accurately, emphasizing both the tactical details and the human cost. Thousands of visitors came each year, many of them descendants of men who had fought there, making pilgrimages to understand what their fathers and grandfathers had endured. The recognition gap between Bastogne and Krinkelt-Rocherath illustrated broader patterns in how societies remember war. Dramatic stories are remembered. Complex tactical victories that prevent disaster are forgotten. Individual heroism is celebrated. Collective defensive actions that save lives by avoiding catastrophe are overlooked. The 101st Airborne at Bastogne fit the narrative of American heroism that the public wanted. Surrounded but defiant, holding against impossible odds, rescued by Patton's dramatic counterattack. The 2nd and 99th at Krinkelt-Rocherath were harder to celebrate. They fought, held, withdrew strategically, and ultimately won by not losing. It was mature, professional military action that lacked the romance of a desperate last stand. The veterans in their final years continued advocating for recognition. They wrote letters to newspapers, they contacted filmmakers and authors, they spoke at schools and military academies. A veteran from the 99th Division, speaking to a college history class in 2007, explained, "We don't want to take anything away from the men at Bastogne. They fought hard and deserved every bit of recognition they got. But we fought just as hard, held just as firm, accomplished just as much. We just want people to know we were there, that we mattered, that what we did made a difference." The students in that class, 60 years removed from the battle, listening to an 85-year-old man describe fighting for his life in a frozen Belgian village, understood that they were hearing testimony to something extraordinary. The counterfactual analysis in Chapter 15 provided the framework for understanding what Krinkelt-Rocherath had prevented. If those villages had fallen on schedule, if the northern shoulder had collapsed, the Battle of the Bulge would have been remembered very differently. American casualties would have been far higher. The war would have lasted longer. The post-war settlement might have been different. All of this was prevented by soldiers who held for 3 days in 2 villages that most people had never heard of. The prevention of disaster is the highest form of military success, but it is the hardest to commemorate. There is no dramatic moment, no visible enemy defeated, only the absence of catastrophe that would have occurred if those soldiers had failed. The last surviving veteran of the Battle of Krinkelt-Rocherath died in 2019, 75 years after the battle. His obituary mentioned his service, his awards, his family. It noted that he had fought in the Battle of the Bulge. It did not mention Krinkelt-Rocherath specifically. With his death, the battle passed from living memory to history, preserved now only in documents, photographs, museums, and the memories of descendants who carry their ancestors' stories. The northern shoulder that held firm, that saved thousands of lives, that determined the outcome of the largest American battle of World War II, had finally become the forgotten shoulder, known to historians and enthusiasts, but absent from popular memory. The injustice of this forgetting is balanced by the certainty of the historical record. What those soldiers accomplished is documented, analyzed, and understood by those who study warfare seriously. Their courage is preserved not in public monuments and Hollywood films, but in military archives and professional military education. It is not the recognition they deserved, but it is recognition nonetheless, and it will endure.